Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the shadows of history where the most powerful woman you have never heard of changed the fate of empires. Picture this, the 13th century. A historian sits at his desk and writes these exact words: the most intelligent woman in the world. He's not talking about a queen, not Cleopatra, not Elena of Aquitaine. He is writing about a woman whose 4 sons became emperors, ruling from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. Her decisions shaped the largest land empire humanity has ever seen. Yet today, if you walk past her grave, you will find something chilling. A blank stone, no name, no words, nothing, as if she never existed. Her name was Sorghachani Becky, and tonight you are going to discover why erasing her from history might be the greatest historical crime ever committed. Before we step into her world together, I want to ask you something. If tonight's story moves you, if it makes you think differently about history, would you consider giving this video a like? And hey, if you are someone who loves discovering the untold stories that textbooks conveniently forgot, hit that subscribe button. I promise you, we have 11 more incredible women coming in this series, and each one will blow your mind. Also, I am genuinely curious. Where are you watching this from right now? Your bedroom? Maybe lying in bed with headphones on? Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are. I love knowing that we're all scattered across the world, but somehow connected through these forgotten stories. All right, dim those lights if you can. Get comfortable. Let that gentle fan or soft rain sound play in the background if you like, and let me take you back to a world of endless grasslands, thundering horses, and a woman who played the longest game of chess in history. Let us start with a question that will haunt this entire story. What makes someone powerful? Is it commanding armies? Sitting on a throne, having your face on coins? Or is real power something quieter, something more dangerous? The kind of power that reshapes the world while everyone is looking somewhere else. The year is around 1190. Somewhere in the vast grasslands of Central Asia, a girl is born into the Keri tribe. Her name is Sorghachani. Now, the Kites are interesting. They are Negotiator Christians, which means they follow a version of Christianity that traveled east along the Silk Road. Her father is a man named Yakagambu, and he is navigating one of the most dangerous political landscapes imaginable because nearby a man is rising to power. A man who will soon be called Genghis Khan. Here is where the story gets fascinating. Sakani's family has to make a choice. Do they ally with this ambitious warrior or do they resist? Her uncle, a man named Togru, actually becomes one of Genghis Khan's early allies. But family politics being what they are, things get complicated. Eventually, Yakagambu sides with Genghis Khan and offers something precious: his daughters. One of those daughters is young Sagani, still a teenager, and she is given in marriage to Tului, the youngest son of Genghis Khan himself. Now, pause for a second. Imagine being that teenage girl. You're handed off to the son of the most feared conqueror in history. Your father will soon be killed in the political chaos that follows. You're in a foreign camp following foreign customs, married to a man you barely know. Most people in that situation would just try to survive, right? Keep your head down, stay safe. But Satani was not most people. She watches, she listens, she learns. Ambra. This is crucial. In Mongol society, women had far more rights than their counterparts in Europe or even China that time. When the men rode off to war, sometimes for years, who managed everything back home? The women. They handled the economy, made decisions, coordinated the massive seasonal migrations of thousands of people and animals. This was not some symbolic role. This was real power. Sorghachani gives birth to 4 sons: Monka, Kubla, Huligu, and Erik Bu. Remember those names because they are about to become some of the most important people in world history. But here is the thing. She does not just give birth to them and hand them off to tutors. No, she personally oversees every aspect of their education. and she does something revolutionary. Although she herself cannot read or write, she recognizes something that most rulers missed. The Mongol Empire is massive and diverse. It contains dozens of cultures, languages, and religions. So what does she do? She has each son learn a different language. One studies Chinese, another learns Persian. They study different cultures, different administrative systems. She is essentially creating future rulers who can actually govern this insanely diverse empire, not just conquer it. But here is where her true genius shows. In 1232, her husband Tui dies. He is only 41 years old. Suddenly, Sogaktani is a widow with 4 young sons in one of the most cutthroat political environments imaginable, and the great Khn at the time, Ugai, Genghis Khan's successor, sees an opportunity. He offers her a deal: marry his son, Guk. This would unite their branches of the family. Now, this is where most historical narratives would have the woman accept, right? Secure her position, remarry into power, play it safe. But Sorgtani says no. She refuses. And this decision, this one moment, changes the entire trajectory of world history. Think about what she is doing here. By refusing to remarry, she is keeping control of her lands, her resources, and most importantly, her son's inheritance. She's also avoiding being swallowed up into another family's power structure. Ugai is so impressed, or maybe frustrated, that he actually gives her administrative control over her late husband's territories. This includes parts of northern China, eastern Mongolia, and regions of Iran. And what does she do with this power? She becomes possibly the best administrator in the entire Mongol Empire. Contemporary sources are not shy about this. The Persian historian Juvani, writing at the time, says she constructed such a basis for her son's success that she basically set them up to rule the world. Another historian, Rashid Alin, writes that she was extremely intelligent and able, and that there is no doubt that it was through her intelligence and ability that she raised the station of her sons above that of their cousins. Let me give you specifics, because this is where it gets really impressive. She takes the Mongol system of taxation, which is pretty basic, and combines it with Chinese bureaucratic methods. She creates a hybrid system that is far more efficient. She's collecting more revenue, but she's also making the system less corrupt. She institutes policies that protect farmers from being overly exploited. Why? Because she understands something crucial. You cannot just squeeze your subjects dry. You need them productive and relatively content if you want long-term stability. She also practices something radical for her time: genuine religious tolerance. Remember, she is a Notorian Christian, but she finances the construction of a madrasa, an Islamic school in Bahara. She gives arms to both Christian and Muslim communities. She makes sure Buddhist and Taoist temples are protected. Her sons grow up seeing this tolerance as normal, as practical, and when they eventually rule, they continue these policies. This is not some feel-good liberalism. This is cold, calculated political genius. Religious conflict tears empires apart. Religious tolerance keeps them together. But the real masterpiece of her political career comes after Ugodai dies in 1241. His wife Tiranar becomes regent and eventually gets her son Guy elected as the next great Khn. Now here is the thing about Guk. He does not like Sorgakani's family. There is bad blood, and when Guk becomes great Khn, it looks like he might move against her and her sons. This is a terrifying time. One wrong move and her entire family could be destroyed. But Sorgtani plays it perfectly. She publicly supports Guk. She and her sons show up to the election ceremony. They pay their respects. They do not give him any excuse to move against them. And then she waits because Guk is not a healthy man. And sure enough, in 1248, just 2 years into his reign, he dies. Now comes the succession crisis, and this is where Sorgatani's decades of preparation pay off. She has spent years building relationships with other powerful nobles. She has proven her administrative competence. Her territories are prosperous and well-run. Her sons are educated, capable, and respected. And she has a powerful ally, Batu Khan, who controls the western part of the empire. Together, they orchestrate one of the most successful political maneuvers in history. In 1251, Atakurai, a grand council, her eldest son, Monk, is elected as the great Khn. This is huge. This shifts power from Ugei's line to Tolu's line, her line permanently. Monka becomes great Khn and rules from 1251 to 1259. When he dies, guess who becomes the next great Khn? Her second son, Kublai. And Kublai Khan, you might have heard of him. He conquers the rest of China and establishes the Yuan dynasty. He rules one of the largest empires in human history. Meanwhile, her third son, Hulagu, conquers Persia and establishes the Ilkhanate. He is He one who sacks Baghdad in 1258. Even her fourth son, Arik Burke, challenges Kublai for the throne. All four of her sons become rulers of vast territories. Think about that for a second. All four sons. That is not luck. That is the result of 40 years of careful planning, education, political maneuvering, and strategic brilliance. One historian calculated that her descendants ruled over more territory and more people than any other family in human history. But here is the devastating part. Soakani dies in 1252, just 1 year after Monka becomes great Khn. She does not live to see Kublai conquer China. She does not see the full flowering of everything she built. And when she dies, her sons are so devastated that some sources suggest Monka himself never fully recovers from losing his mother. And then over time something terrible happens. History forgets her. The chronicles focus on her son's conquests. They talk about Genghis Khan, about Kublai Khan, about Hulagu. But Sakani, she gets a footnote, maybe a paragraph. And here is the most haunting detail. When you go to where she is buried near her husband's memorial, you find a stone marker, and that marker, unlike every other important Mongol leader memorial, has no inscription. It is completely blank. Some historians think this blank stone was intentional. Maybe her sons wanted to leave it blank because no words could capture who she was. Maybe it was meant to be filled in later and just never was. Or maybe, just maybe, it is a metaphor for how history treated her. Erased, forgotten, reduced to nothing. But here is what really gets me. Those male historians I mentioned earlier, Juvani and Rashid al-Din, they knew. They wrote about her genius. They called her the wisest person of her age, man or woman. They explicitly stated that without her, her sons would never have achieved what they did. So it is not like the informatio. N was not there. Later historians just chose to ignore it. They chose to focus on conquest and battles and emperors. They chose to erase the woman who made it all possible. And this is the pattern we're going to see again in this series. Women who saved empires, who made the crucial decisions at the crucial moments, who demonstrated intelligence and political skill that matched or exceeded any man of their era. And yet they were forgotten, not because they were not important, but because history is written by people who cannot imagine women being that important. Sagani Biki governed territories spanning thousands of miles. She reformed taxation systems. She prevented religious civil wars through tolerance policies. She educated 4 sons who became emperors. She outmaneuvered some of the most ruthless political operators in history. She did all of this without commanding a single army, without sitting on a throne, without having her face on a single coin. That is power, real power, the kind that changes the world. So next time someone tells you that women were not involved in shaping history, that they were just passive observers, that they did not have the capacity for political leadership. Remember Sorgani Becky. Remember the woman with the blank stone. Remember the mother of Kays, who was called the most intelligent person in the world by the people who actually knew her. And ask yourself, how many other stories like this have we lost? How many other brilliant women have been erased from history, reduced to footnotes, forgotten entirely? The answer, as you're about to discover in the next part of this series, is far more than you think. We've only just begun uncovering these stories. And trust me, what comes next will shake everything you thought you knew about how empires actually survived. Stay with me. From the steppes of Mongolia, let us travel west to a city that was once the center of the world, Constantinople, the year 532. And I need to tell you about a moment that happened in January of that year, because it is one of the most dramatic turning points in history. A moment when an entire empire almost collapsed, and the person who saved it, a woman that many people in power absolutely despised. Her name was Theodora. And before we go any further, I need you to understand something. The man who wrote the most detailed account of her life, a historian named Procopius, hated her guts. He wrote an entire secret book just to trash her reputation. And yet, even in his hatred, even in his attempts to destroy her legacy, he could not hide the fact that she was one of the most formidable political minds of her era. Sometimes the people who hate you the most tell the truth about your power without meaning to. So, who was Theodora before she became an empress? Here is where it gets complicated, because we have to separate propaganda from reality. According to Procopius in his scandalous secret history, she was an actress and entertainer. Now in 6th century Byzantium, being an actress was not like being a Hollywood star. It was actually considered a pretty low status, profession often associated with prostitution. Procopius goes into graphic, almost certainly exaggerated detail about her past. But here is the thing. Even if we take the most charitable interpretation of his claims, what we know for sure is that she came from the absolute bottom of Byzantine society. Her father was a bearer at the Hippodromium, the massive stadium where chariot races were held. When he died, her family was destitute. Theodora had to work from a very young age. She was smart, she was beautiful, and she was ambitious. And somehow this young woman from the Bear Pits caught the attention of Justinian, the nephew of the reigning emperor. Now, Justinian was not emperor yet, but everyone knew he would be. He was being groomed for power, and he fell completely in love with Theodora. Not just infatuated, actually in love, so much so that he wanted to marry her, but there was a massive problem. Roman law explicitly forbade men of senatorial rank from marrying actresses. It was literally illegal. So what does Justinian do? He gets his uncle, Emperor Justin I, to change the law. They pass a new law that says essentially if an actress repents and leaves her former life, she can marry anyone. This is huge. This is rewriting fundamental Roman law for one woman. And in 525, they get married. 2 years later, in 527, Justin dies, and Justinian becomes emperor, and Theodora becomes empress, not just in title, but in actual power. Justinian does something almost unprecedented. He makes her a full co-ruler. She appears on coins next to him. She issues her own edicts. She receives foreign ambassadors. This is not some ceremonial role. She's wielding real imperial authority. But here is where the story gets really intense. 5 years into their reign, in January of 532, something goes terribly wrong. You have to understand Constantinople at this time is a powder keg. There are these two major factions, kind of like sports teams, but way more serious, called the Blues and the Greens. They are chariot racing fan clubs, but they are also basically political gangs. They control neighborhoods. They fight each other in the streets, and usually the emperor plays them against each other to maintain control. But in January 532, something unprecedented happens. The blues and the greens unite. They unite against Justinian, and it starts at the chariot races in the Hippodromium. The crowd begins chanting, "Na, na," which means victory, victory. But they are not cheering for chariots. They're calling for the emperor to be overthrown. Within hours, the protest becomes a fou, scale riot. Within days, it becomes a revolution. The rioters storm through Constantinople, setting fire to buildings. And we're not talking about a few buildings. They burn the church of Hagia Sophia, one of the greatest churches in Christendom. They burn the Senate House. They burn the public baths. Massive sections of the city are engulfed in flames. The historian Procopius, who was actually there, estimates that nearly half of Constantinople is destroyed. And here is the terrifying part. The rioters find an alternative emperor. They crown a man named Hypatius, a nephew of a former emperor, right there in the Hippodromium. They are not just protesting anymore. They are attempting a complete regime change, and it is working. Inside the imperial palace, Justinian is panicking. His advisors are panicking. They have lost control of the city. The army is divided. They cannot trust which soldiers will stay loyal. And after 5 days of this chaos, Justinian makes a decision. He is going to flee. He is going to take whatever gold he can carry, get on a ship, and escape across the Bosphorus. He is ready to abandon the throne, abandon Constantinople, abandon everything. His advisors agree. They start making preparations. They are getting ships ready. And then Theodora stands up. And can you imagine this moment? The room full of men, all of them ready to run. And this woman who came from the bare pits of the Hippodromium speaks, and what she says will echo through history, according to the historian Procopius, who again hated her but was actually present. She says something like this: "I do not think flight is the right course, even if it should bring us to safety. Every person born into this world must die. But for one who has reigned, it would be intolerable to be a fugitive. May I never be separated from this purple robe. And may I never live to see the day when those who meet me do not address me as Empress. If you wish to save yourself, Caesar, this is not difficult. We are rich. There is the sea, and there are the ships. But consider whether if you reach safety you might not prefer death to that safety. As for me, I like the old saying that the purple makes the best burial shroud." Let me say that again. The purple makes the best burial shroud. She is literally telling him that she would rather die as an empress than live as a fugitive. And more than that, she is shaming him. She is saying, without directly saying it, that he is being a coward. Now think about what is happening here. This woman, who 5 years earlier was considered too low class to legally marry into the aristocracy, is the only person in that room with the courage to stand firm, while men who were born into power, who are trained for leadership, who commanded armies, are ready to flee. She is ready to stay and fight, and it works. Justinian, stung by her words, inspired by her courage, changes his mind. He decides to stay. But now they need a plan, and this is where Theodora shows not just courage, but tactical genius. She suggests they use the one thing that might work: divide the rioters. They still have some loyal troops led by 2 generals, Belisarius and Mundus, and they still have money. Theodora suggests they send an agent, a man named Nas, into the Hippodromium with bags of gold. His mission: find members of the blue faction and remind them that Justinian has historically favored them, bribe them, turn them against the greens, break the unity of the revolt while Narus is working on this. Belisarius and Mundus are positioning troops. And here is the brutal part. They're going to trap the Rheers in the Hippodromium. See, the Rheers have gathered there with their new emperor, Hypatius. They think they are safe. They think they have won. They are celebrating. Narcissus manages to peel off some of the blues, not all of them, but enough to create confusion. And then Belisarius makes his move. His troops enter the Hippodromium from multiple entrances. The rioters realize too late that they are trapped, and what follows is a massacre. Byzantine troops cut down men, women. anyone in the Hippodromium. The ancient sources claim somewhere between 30,000 and 35,000 people are killed in a single afternoon. It is absolutely brutal. Hypatius, the rival emperor, is captured and executed. The revolt is crushed. Constantinople is saved and Justinian remains emperor. But here is what I want you to really understand. Without Theodora, none of this happens. Without her speech, Justinian flees, the empire falls into civil war and everything changes. One woman's courage in one moment alters the course of history, and she does not stop there. Over the next 20 years until her death in 548, Theodora uses her power to fundamentally reshape Byzantine society, especially for women. She passes laws that give women the right to own property independently. She makes it illegal for a husband to use his wife's dowry without her consent. She establishes the death penalty for rape, which was revolutionary for the time. Most societies treated rape as a property crime against the woman's father or husband. Theodora made it a crime deserving of execution. She also did something remarkable. She fought against human trafficking. She found out that there were brothel owners who were essentially enslaving young girls, buying them from poor families and forcing them into prostitution. Theodora shut down these operations. She bought the freedom of over 500 young women. She set up a home for them, a place where they could live safely. Some sources say a few of these women the only life they knew actually threw themselves from the windows rather than live in this new situation. It tells you how psychologically damaged they were. But Theodora tried. She used imperial power to protect the most vulnerable women in society. And on the bigger stage, she was instrumental in Justinian's military campaigns, when Belisarius conquered North Africa from the Vandals, when Byzantine forces retook parts of Italy from the Ostrogoths. Theodora was involved in the strategic planning. She corresponded with generals. She made decisions about troop movements and resource allocation. The reconquest of the Western Roman Empire, which had fallen decades earlier, was as much her project as Justinian's. She also played a fascinating role in religious politics. This is getting into the weeds a bit, but there were major theological disputes happening in Christianity at the time. Theodora supported the Monophysite Christians, while Justinian leaned more toward Chalcedonian orthodoxy. She actually protected Monophysite leaders in the palace, hiding them from persecution. She was running her own religious policy that sometimes contradicted her husband's, and Justinian let her. That tells you how much power she actually had. Oh, and one more thing. That legal code I mentioned, the Corpus Juris Civilis, the comprehensive codification of Roman law that became the foundation of legal systems across Europe. Theodora influenced that too. Many of the laws protecting women's rights, the anti-trafficking provisions, the property rights, those came from her advocacy. So by any objective measure, Theodora was one of the most effective rulers of the Byzantine Empire. She saved the throne in its darkest hour. She reformed laws. She protected vulnerable populations. She helped reconquer lost territories. She was a political genius and a social reformer. And yet, how is she remembered? Procopius, in his official histories written during her lifetime, is relatively respectful. But after she dies, he writes his secret history, filled with salacious gossip and character assassination. For centuries, that became the dominant narrative about her. The scandalous empress, the former actress, the woman of ill root who seduced an emperor. It is only in modern scholarship that historians have started to look past the propaganda and see the truth. Theodora was extraordinary. She was smart, she was tough, she was strategic, and she had more courage in that moment, in 532, than any man in that room. She literally saved the Byzantine Empire from collapse, and then spent the next 16 years making it better. So why was her reputation destroyed? Why did later historians focus on her alleged scandalous past rather than her actual accomplishments? I think you know the answer. A powerful woman who came from nothing and rose to rule an empire, who made her own decisions, who sometimes contradicted her husband and got away with it. That was too threatening. The narrative had to be controlled. She had to be reduced to her sexuality, to scandal, to something that could be dismissed. But history has a way of revealing truth. And the truth is that Theodora was a titan. She was the woman in the purple who chose death over dishonor, and, in choosing to stay, saved everything. Think about that the next time someone implies that women in history were just decorative, just consorts, just supporting characters in men's stories. Theodora was the main character. She just had to wait more than 1,000 years for people to figure that out. Now, we've seen two women so far, one who built an empire from the shadows through pure intelligence, and one who saved an empire through raw courage in its darkest moment. But what about the women who operated at even deeper levels? The women whose names you've probably never heard, but whose actions quite literally prevented emperors from being overthrown. You're going deeper. Still, stay with me. Picture a woman standing in a military camp somewhere on the frontiers of the Roman Empire. She's wearing Roman dress, but she speaks with a Syrian accent. Around her, hardened soldiers bow their heads in respect. She's reviewing supply lines, making decisions about troop movements, settling disputes between commanders. And here is the kicker. She is not visiting. This is her job. Her official title, Mother of the Camps. Her actual role, running the Roman Empire while everyone pretends her husband is doing it. Her name was Julia Domner. And for 23 years, she was arguably the most powerful person in Rome. Yet, if you ask most people to name powerful Roman women, they will say Cleopatra, who was not even Roman. They might mention Livia or Agrena. But Julia Domner, the woman who literally kept the empire functioning while emperors came and went, crickets. So, let me introduce you to someone who should be a household name. Julia Domner was born around the year 160 in the Syrian city of Amsa, modern-day Homs. Her father was the high priest of the sun god Elagabalus. This is important because it means she came from a wealthy, educated, influential family, but she was not Roman, she was Syrian. And in the Roman Empire, that mattered. There was always this underlying snobbery, this sense that real power belonged to old Italian families, not provincials from the East. But Julia was brilliant, educated, and ambitious, and in 187 she married a man named Septimius Sais, a Roman general who was also from North Africa. So already we have this interesting couple, both from the provinces, both outsiders to the traditional Roman elite. And somehow they made that work for them rather than against them. In 193, after a series of civil wars, Septimius Sais becomes emperor, and Julia Domner becomes empress. But unlike many emperors' wives, she does not stay in Rome hosting dinner parties. No, she goes with him on military campaigns for years at a time. This is unprecedented. Roman empresses did not typically travel with armies, but Julia did. And she was not just there for moral support, she was actively involved. The sources call her mother of the camps and mother of the army, and this was not some honorary title. She was present at military councils. Generals reported to her. She handled correspondence with governors. She managed logistics. Think about what this means. The Roman Empire at this time stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Keeping it running required constant attention to detail, tax collection, grain shipments, road maintenance, military supply lines, diplomatic, relations with dozens of client states. Someone had to coordinate all of this, and increasingly, that someone was Julia. Here is a specific example. In 208, Septimius Sais is campaigning in Britain, trying to conquer what is now Scotland. He is older, he's not in great health, and he is focused on military matters. Who is handling everything else? Julia. She is essentially serving as co-emperor, managing the civil administration while he manages the military side. Contemporary sources make it clear that she was not just signing documents her husband told her to sign. She was making real decisions, and she did something fascinating with her position. She created what historians call a salon, or circle of intellectuals. She gathered philosophers, writers, historians, and scientists around her, People like Philostratus, who wrote biographies of famous sophists, or Galen, one of the greatest medical minds of antiquity. These people benefited from her patronage, and in return they produced works that preserved Greek and Roman learning. This might sound frivolous, but it was not. Learning and culture were dying out in some parts of the empire. Julia mad. It her mission to protect and promote intellectual life. She also appears on coins. Now you might think, so what? But this is huge. Imperial coinage was serious business in Rome. Who appeared on coins was a statement about who held power, and Julia appears on coins alongside her husband, sometimes even with equal prominence. The inscriptions call her Augusta, which is the female version of Augustus, the highest imperial title. This is the empire publicly acknowledging her authority. Then, in 211, Septimus Sais dies in Britain, and things get complicated fast. See, Julia and Septimius had 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. And these brothers hated each other. I mean, truly despised one another. When Septimius died, he supposedly told them to agree with each other, enrich the soldiers, and ignore everyone else. Great advice, Dad. Really diplomatic. The brothers could not agree on anything. They each wanted sole power. They literally proposed dividing the empire in half, with Caracalla ruling the west and Geta ruling the east. This would have been catastrophic. The empire had just gone through decades of civil war. Splitting it would guarantee more war. And who talked them out of this insane plan? Julia. She convinced them to at least pretend to share power and return to Rome together. But the hatred continued. The palace in Rome became a war zone. The brothers could not be in the same room without guards present. They each had their own factions of soldiers loyal to them. Rome was on the brink of civil war again, and Julia was stuck in the middle, trying desperately to keep the peace. Then in 212 something horrible happens. Caracalla invites Geta to meet with their mother, supposedly to reconcile. Julia probably hoped this would be a breakthrough. Instead, Caracalla's soldiers burst in and murder Geta. And get this, Geta dies in Julia's arms. His blood is on her clothes. She's literally holding her dying son while her other son's guards stand there. Can you imagine that moment? The trauma, the horror. One son murders the other, and she is the witness. And here is where it gets even darker. Caracalla then launches a purge. Anyone suspected of being loyal to Geta is killed. We are talking thousands of people, senators, soldiers, servants, anyone. Ancient sources claim up to 20,000 people were executed in the aftermath. Rome became a bloodbath. And Julia, she could have fallen apart. She could have withdrawn from public life. Instead, she did something remarkable. She kept working because someone had to run the empire. Caracalla was paranoid, increasingly erratic, and obsessed with military glory. He wanted to be the next Alexander the Great. So, in 213, he left Rome to campaign in the east, first in Germany, then in the eastern provinces, planning an invasion of Parthia. And who governed Rome in his absence? Julia, for the next 5 years, while Caracalla chased military glory. Julia Domna essentially ruled the Roman Empire. She was not regent for a child. She was not a placeholder. She was the actual administrator, keeping everything running. She handled correspondence with provincial governors. She made judicial decisions. She managed the treasury. Ancient historians explicitly state that nothing happened without her approval. The historian Cassius Dio, who was a contemporary and actually served in the Senate during this period, writes about her power. He's not always complimentary, but he makes it clear that Julia was the one really in charge. Another historian, Herodian, describes her as effectively ruling alongside Caracalla, with her authority being recognized throughout the empire. But here is what really gets me. Despite all this power, despite all this responsibility, Julia was in an impossible position. She was grieving one murdered son, W. Heil. serving the son who murdered him. She knew Caracalla was becoming increasingly unstable. Ancient sources describe him as paranoid, cruel, possibly mentally ill, but what could she do? If she opposed him, she would be killed. If she abandoned her position, the empire would collapse into chaos. So she stayed. She kept working. She kept the machine running. And then in 217, Caracalla is assassinated. He is murdered by one of his own soldiers while urinating on the side of a road during the Pantheon campaign. Seriously, that is how he died. Unceremonious, pathetic, killed while literally relieving himself. When news reaches Julia, she knows what is coming. A man named Macrinus, the Taurian prefect, seizes power and declares himself emperor, and Macrinus knows Julia dangerous. She's too competent, too respected, too connected. People might rally around her, so he starts making moves against her. Julia is also sick. Ancient sources mention she has breast cancer, something that has been growing worse, and now she's watching everything he worked for, everything she sacrificed for crumble. Both her sons were dead. Her husband is dead. The empire she ran for decades is being taken over by an upstart who was never meant to rule. So Julia Domina makes a choice. She stops eating. She essentially commits suicide by starvation. The exact details are murky, but most sources agree that she died by refusing OD. She died in Antioch in 217, possibly from the cancer, possibly from elf-inflicted starvation, probably from both. Think about the tragedy here. Oman, who literally ran the Roman Empire for a quarter century, who held it together through civil wars, fratricidal murders, and administrative challenges, protected learning and culture, who was called Mother of the Senate and Mother of the Fatherland, who appeared en coins as Augusta. She dies alone, sick, grieving, and watching everything collapse. And then history forgets her. The focus shifts to her husband, Septimius Sais, the military emperor, or to Caracalla, the cruel tyrant. Julia becomes a footnote, maybe a paragraph. And he was married to Julia Donna, who was from Syria. That is it. That is what most history books give her. But the people who lived through her era knew. Cassius Dio knew. Herodian knew. They wrote about her power. They acknowledged, sometimes reluctantly, that she was essential. They could not deny what everyone saw, that Julia Domna was not just an empress. She was the empress, the one who actually did the work. And there is something else that strikes me. Julia was Syrian. She was not from an old Roman family. She was an outsider who reached the absolute pinnacle of power through intelligence, education, and sheer competence. And maybe that is part of why she was forgotten, because she did not fit the narrative of what a Roman emperor should be. She was too foreign, too educated, too powerful in her own right. You know what is interesting? Her sister Julia Mesa and her nieces Julia Soemius and Julia Mamaia also became incredibly powerful. After Julia Donner died, her sister basically ran the empire for years, manipulating the succession, making and unmaking emperors. The Syrian women of this family were kingmakers. They were the power behind multiple thrones. And yet, if you look at popular history, at the documentaries and books, they barely get mentioned. Why? Because acknowledging them means acknowledging something uncomfortable, that the Roman Empire at its height was often run by women, and not just any women, but provincial women from Syria, women who were smarter and more capable than most of the men who wore the purple. Julia Domner spent 23 years keeping an empire running. She traveled with armies, made military decisions, governed provinces, preserve, deculture, and held everything together, while men took credit. She buried both her sons. She died alone and grief-stricken, and history then thanked her by reducing her to a footnote. But she was there. She mattered. She changed history. And every time you hear about the Severine dynasty, remember that dynasty survived and thrived because of Julia Domina, the mother of camps, the mother of the Senate, the Syrian philosopher queen who actually ran Rome, we have now met three women who saved empires, one through decades of patient planning, one through courage in a single crisis moment, and one through 23 years of tireless administration. But here is where things get even more fascinating. What about the women who saved empires and were not even free? What about the enslaved women, whose intelligence made them indispensable to power? That story is next, and it is going to surprise you. Sometimes the most important person in a room is the one nobody notices, the one taking notes. In the corner, the one everyone assumes is just part of the furniture. And in ancient Rome, there was one woman like that. A woman who was born enslaved, who legally had no rights, who could be bought and sold like property. And yet one night, that woman wrote a single letter that exposed the greatest conspiracy in Roman history, saved an emperor, and prevented a civil war that could have destroyed the empire. Her name was Keynes, and I need to tell you her story because it reveals something we often miss about how power actually works. We imagine power as something visible, something announced with trumpets and crowned with laurels. But real power, sometimes it belongs to the person nobody is watching. So who was Keynes? The truth is, we do not know much about her early life because, well, she was enslaved. Roman historians did not typically care about the childhoods of enslaved people. What we do know is that she was born somewhere in the eastern Mediterranean, probably in the early years of the 1st century. She was foreign born, which in Rome meant she was considered even lower status than Roman-born enslaved people, and somehow she ended up as property of Antonia Minor. Now, Antonia Minor was, to put it mildly, connected. She was the daughter of Mark Antony. Yes, that Mark Antony who was with Cleopatra. She was the niece of Emperor Augustus, the first Roman emperor. She was the mother of Claudius, who would later become emperor. She was the grandmother of Caligula, who also became emperor. This woman was at the absolute center of imperial family politics, and Antonia needed a secretary, someone to manage her correspondence, keep records, handle the massive amount of information that flowed through the household of someone that important. And she chose Keynes. Why? Because Keynes had a gift that was rarer than gold in the ancient world, a perfect memory. We're not talking about a good memory. We're talking about what modern psychologists would call eidetic memory, photographic memory. Keynes could hear something once and remember it word for word years later. She could see a document and recall every line. In a world before printing presses, before photocopiers, before computer files, this ability made her invaluable. Think about what this meant for Antonia. Every sensitive conversation, every secret negotiation, every piece of blackmail-worthy information that passed through her household, Keynes remembered it. She became Antonia's living archive. And because she was enslaved, because she was legally property, people talked freely around her. Senators, generals, members of the imperial family, they all assumed she did not matter. They were wrong. Now, let us talk about the year 31. The emperor this time is Tiberius. He is the stepson of Augustus, and he's been ruling CE 14. But here is the thing about Tiberius. He hates being emperor. He's paranoid. He trusts almost nobody. And by 31, he is basically retired to the island of Capri. He is still emperor, but he is governing remotely from his island villa, refusing to come back to Rome. And who is running things in his absence? A man named Silvanus. Senus is the Taurian prefect, which means he commands the Taurian guard, the elite soldiers who protect the emperor. But Silvanus wants more than that. He wants to be emperor himself, and he's been working on this plan for years. Let me paint the picture of how brilliant and terrifying Sejanus was. First, he convinced Tiberius to consolidate all the Taurian guard barracks into one location in Rome. This gave him direct control over thousands of elite troops in the heart of the city. Then he systematically eliminated anyone who might oppose him. He had Tiberius's son, Drusus, poisoned. He married into the imperial family. He got himself appointed as joint consul with Tiberius, which was unprecedented for someone who was not from the imperial family. He was building a power base that would allow him to overthrow Tiberius and seize the throne. And Tiberius, isolated on Capri, suspicious of everyone, was starting to trust Cinus more than anyone else. The fox was not just in the henhouse. The fox was basically running the henhouse while the farmer slept. But Sejanus made one mistake. He underestimated an old woman and her enslaved secretary. See, Antonia was watching. She had survived decades of imperial politics. She had seen the fall of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. She had navigated the dangerous reign of Augustus. She knew how coups worked, and she was seeing the signs. Antonia had her own network of informants, people loyal to her, people who owed her favors, people who were scared of what Cinus was planning. And information kept coming to Silvanus was meeting secretly with certain senators. He was moving his most loyal troops into key positions. He was spreading rumors about Tiberius being mentally unfit. He was preparing for something big. But here is Antonia's problem. How do you tell the emperor that his most trusted advisor is plotting to kill him? You cannot just send a normal letter. Sejanus controls the Taurian Guard. Any messenger Antonia sends could be intercepted, killed, or bought off. Any letter could be opened and read. If Cinus finds out that Antonia knows, he will kill her and everyone in her household before she can warn Tiberius. So Antonia comes up with a plan. She needs to send a message that is so detailed, so convincing that Tiberius will act immediately. But she also needs it to be secure. And this is where Cinus becomes the most important person in the empire. Antonia dictates the letter to Cinus. But this is not a simple letter. This is a comprehensive report of the conspiracy. Names, dates, meetings, specific conversations, everything Antonia knows, everything her informants have told her, all organized into a detailed case that Cinus is planning a coup. And Cinus writes it all down. Now, can you imagine the pressure Cinus is under? She is enslaved. She has no legal protection. If this goes wrong, if Silvanus finds out, she will be tortured to death. That is what happened to enslaved people who were involved in political conspiracies. They were interrogated under torture, then executed. But Kenneth writes the letter anyway. And then comes the question, how to deliver it. Antonia chooses her most trusted freedman, a man named Pallas, who is also Keynes's close friend, possibly her brother. The plan is risky. Pallas will travel to Capri supposedly on routine business, carrying the letter hidden on his person. If he is searched, if the letter is found, both he and Antonia and Cinus are dead. But Pallas makes it. He arrives at Capri and gets the letter to Tiberius. And when Tiberius reads it, everything clicks into place. All the things that had seemed slightly off, all the small suspicions he had been suppressing suddenly make sense. Cinus is not loyal. Cinus is the threat. Tiberius acts immediately. But he has to be smart about this because Cinus controls the Taurian Guard. If Tiberius makes the wrong move, the Guard could turn on him. So Tiberius writes a letter to the Senate summoning them to meet. He sends it with a trusted officer, and on October 18th in the year 31, the Senate convenes, expecting routine business. Sejanus shows up, confident. He probably expects to be awarded more honors, more power. The letter from Tiberius is read aloud. It starts by praising Silvanus. Senators are nodding along, and then the letter turns. Tiberius starts criticizing Cinus, then accusing him, then explicitly ordering his arrest. The Senate is stunned. Cinus is confused. And before he can react, before the Taurian Guard can do anything, other soldiers loyal to Tiberius arrest Sages right there in the Senate chamber. He is taken to prison. That same day he is executed. Not a trial, not a defense, just immediate execution. And then the purge begins. Anyone associated with Sinanus, anyone suspected of being part of the conspiracy is arrested. We are talking thousands of people, senators, knights, soldiers, administrators. Mass executions happen over the following weeks. The historian Tacitus, writing decades later, describes it as a bloodbath. Rome is in terror. Nobody knows who will be arrested next, but the empire survives. The coup is stopped. Civil war is averted. And why? Because an enslaved woman wrote a letter. Let's sink in for a moment. The Roman Empire, the most powerful state of the world at that time, was saved by a woman who Why had no rights, no freedom, no power? A woman who could have been killed on a whim by her owner, and yet without her perfect memory, without her ability to organize all that information into a coherent warning, Silvanus might have succeeded. The entire history of Rome could have been different. Now, here is where the story gets interesting. After this, Antonia frees Caenis. This is not just a nice gesture. Roman law said that enslaved people who performed exceptional service could be granted freedom. And Caenis had performed the most exceptional service imaginable. She becomes a freed woman, which means she is still legally tied to Antonia, still obligated to her, but she is no longer enslaved. She can own property, make contracts, live her own life, and Kenneth, now free, continues working for Antonia, because she is that good at what she does. She remains Antonia's secretary, managing her affairs, handling correspondence. And during this time, sometime in the 32nd of the 1st century, she meets a man, a young Roman officer from a relatively minor family, not particularly distinguished, not particularly wealthy. His name is Titus Flavius Vespasianus. We know him as Vespasian. And they fall in love, or at least they form a relationship. Ancient sources are clear that they had an affair that lasted years, possibly decades. But here is the cruel twist. They cannot marry. Roman law explicitly forbids men of senatorial rank from marrying freed women. And as Vespasian's career advances as he becomes a senator, then a general, the legal barrier between them becomes insurmountable. So, Caenis becomes Vespasian's unofficial partner. They live together. They are faithful to each other. Everyone knows they are together, but legally she can never be his wife. It is this weird legal fiction where everyone acknowledges the relationship but cannot officially recognize it. Then in 69 to years of civil war after 4, emperors rise and fall in a single year. Vespasian becomes emperor. The man Caenis, loved, becomes the most powerful person in the empire. And what happens? Does he marry her now that he is emperor? Now that he can change any law he wants? No, because even as Emperor Vespasian cannot quite break that taboo. The Senate, the old aristocratic families, they would never accept an ex-enslaved woman as empress. So Caenis remains his common law wife. The ancient sources describe her as living in the palace, as being treated with respect, as having influence over Vespasian's decisions. But officially she is nothing. Think about the bitter irony of this. Caenis saved the empire in 31. 38 years later, the man she loves becomes emperor, partly because of the stability her actions helped preserve, and she still cannot be recognized as his wife. She's still marked by her past as enslaved, still limited by laws that define her as lesser. The historian Cassius Dio, writing in the 3rd century, mentions Caenis specifically. He says that she had tremendous influence over Vespasian, that people would pay her to intercede with the emperor on their behalf, and that she essentially sold access to imperial favor. Some historians read this as corruption. I read it as a woman making the most of an impossible situation. She had no official power, no legal status, but she had the ear of the emperor, so she used it. Caenis died around the year 74. We don't know exactly how or where. She just disappears from the historical record. Did she get a state funeral, a monument, public recognition for saving the empire 40 years earlier? No. She got A few lines in some ancient histories, most of which focus on her relationship with Vespasian rather than her own accomplishments. And this is what breaks my heart about her story. Kynanis was brilliant. She had abilities that made her indispensable to some of the most powerful people in Rome. She saved the empire from one of the most dangerous conspiracies in its history. She lived through decades of political turmoil, always at the center of power, always essential, always unrecognized. She could not vote. She could not hold office. She could not even legally marry the man she loved, even when he became emperor. But she mattered. She changed history. And then history forgot her name. Do you know what I find most fascinating about Kynanis? Her intelligence network. Think about it. For decades, she was at the center of information flow in Rome. First as Antonius' secretary, then as Vespasian's partner. She knew who owed favors to whom. She knew which senators were corrupt. She knew which generals were competent and which were frauds. She had access to secrets that could destroy careers or save lives. And she used that information carefully, strategically. When it mattered most, when the empire was genuinely at risk, she acted. She wrote that letter. She risked her life. But she also knew when to be quiet, when to hold information back, when to let events unfold. That is sophisticated political intelligence. But because she was formerly enslaved, because she was a woman, because she operated in the shadows rather than in public, history barely remembers her. She gets a few paragraphs, usually focusing on her romantic relationship with Vespasian, reducing her to an interesting footnote about an emperor's love life. The truth is so much bigger than that. Kynanis was one of the most important political operators in first-century Rome. She just had to do it quietly, without recognition, without power, relying only on her intelligence and her relationships. And here is the question I keep coming back to. How many other Kens were there? How many other enslaved people, freed people, servants, secretaries, working in the shadows who shaped history in ways we will never know, because nobody thought their stories were worth recording? We have met 4 women now, an empress from the steppes who shaped an empire through her sons, an empress from the bare pits who saved Constantinople through courage, a Syrian philosopher queen who ran Rome for decades, and an enslaved woman whose perfect memory stopped a coup. 4 women, 4 different paths to power, 4 stories that history tried to erase. But these women had something in common besides being forgotten. They all understood something fundamental. Power is not just about sitting on a throne or commanding armies. Power is about being essential, being the person others depend on, being the one who knows things, who can do things, who makes things work. And sometimes the most powerful person in the empire is the one writing the letters nobody else can write. We're about to meet someone who took that principle even further. Someone who was not just essential to one person, but to an entire imperial family. Someone whose actions in a single night changed everything. Stay with me. We're going deeper still. You know what is interesting about whistleblowers? They almost never benefit from speaking out. They risk everything. They expose corruption or danger. They save countless lives or institutions. And then what? They get ignored, attacked, or conveniently forgotten. And in ancient Rome, there was one woman who fits that description perfectly. She uncovered the most dangerous conspiracy in the empire. She saved an emperor from assassination. She prevented a civil war that would have killed thousands. And history thanked her by barely mentioning her name, Antonia Minor. And I want you to really think about her position, because it was unique in all of Roman history. This woman was the daughter of Mark Antony. Yes, the Mark Antony who loved Cleopatra and lost the world. She was the niece of Augustus, the first Roman emperor. She was the grandmother of Caligula and Nero, 2 of the most infamous emperors. She was the mother of Claudius, who everyone thought was an idiot, but who actually turned out to be a pretty decent emperor. This woman was connected to more imperial power than almost anyone in Roman history, and yet most people today have no idea who she was. Let me set the scene differently than we have before. Imagine living your entire life at the absolute center of the most dangerous political environment imaginable. You are born into the family that rules the world. But that means every birthday party is a political calculation. Every family dinner could end in assassination. Every marriage is a strategic alliance. Every child you have is either a potential heir or a potential threat. That was Antonia's life from the day she was born in the year 36 before the Common Era. Her father was Mark Antony, one of the most powerful men in Rome, part of the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus. Her mother was Octavia, who was Octavian's sister. So Antonia was born literally into the heart of the power struggle that would determine whether Rome stayed a republic or became an empire. And when she was just a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old, her father killed himself after losing the Battle of Actium. He died in Egypt in the arms of Cleopatra, having lost everything, gambling on love and ambition. Think about what that must have been like for young Antonia. Your father is declared an enemy of Rome. His name is mud. His statues are torn down. And you are just a kid trying to make sense of it all. But here is the thing. Her uncle Octavian, who defeated her father, who now becomes Augustus, the first emperor, he does something relatively merciful. He does not punish Antonia or her mother. Instead, he brings them into his household. He essentially adopts them into the new imperial family. So Antonia grows up in the palace of Augustus. She is raised alongside the children and grandchildren of the emperor. She receives the best education available. She learns politics by watching the masters. And she marries a man named Drusus, who is Augustus's stepson, the son of his wife Livia from her first marriage. So now Antonia is even more deeply embedded in the imperial family tree. It is getting complicated, I know. Roman imperial families make modern royal families look simple. Antonia and Drusus have 3 children who survive to adulthood. One of them is Claudius, who will become emperor. Another is Germanicus, who becomes one of Rome's most popular generals. The third is Livilla. And here is where Antonia's life gets really interesting. Her husband Dus dies in the year 9 while on a military campaign in Germany. She's a widow at maybe 30 years old, and she makes a choice that defines the rest of her life. She never remarries. Now this is unusual. High-status Roman widows were usually expected to remarry. It was how families maintained alliances and power. But Antonia says no. She stays a widow for the rest of her life, which is another 48 years. 48 years. And during that time, she becomes one of the most influential people in Rome, not through marriage, not through holding office, but through being the person everyone trusted, the person everyone talked to, the person who knew everything. See, Antonia had something incredibly valuable in Roman politics: legitimacy. She was respected. She had survived multiple regime changes. She was connected to everyone important. She was not seen as a threat because she was not trying to put her own son on the throne, at least not obviously. And she was smart, really, really smart. So people came to her, senators seeking advice, generals reporting before campaigns, merchants wanting introductions. And Antonia listened. She remembered. She built this vast network of information. Have you ever been in a position where you know something dangerous, something that could get you killed if the wrong people find out you know? That is where Antonia finds herself in the late 20s of the 1st century. She starts hearing things, little pieces of information that do not quite add up. Suganis, the Taurian prefect, is acting strangely. He is consolidating power. He is eliminating rivals. He is getting too close to Emperor Tiberius. Now, we talked about Silvanus in the last part, but I want you to understand him from Antonia's perspective. She has known Sejanus for years. She's watched him rise from a relatively minor position to become the 2nd most powerful person in Rome. She has seen how he operates, and she is starting to realize something terrifying. Suganus is planning to overthrow Tiberius and seize the throne for himself. But here is her problem. How do you prove something like that? Senus is smart. He does not write down his plans. He does not announce his intentions. He works through intermediaries, through loyal soldiers, through carefully worded suggestions. And more importantly, who is going to believe her? Tiberius trusts Shanes more than he trusts anyone. If Antonia accuses Silvanus without proof, Silvanus could turn it around, make it look like she is the one plotting, and have her killed. So Antonia does what any good intelligence operator does. B builds a case. She starts actively cultivating informants, people who owe her favors, people who are scared of what Senus is doing, people who notice things. One of Silvanus's supporters gets drunk and says too much. A guard mentions that Silvanus is meeting secretly with certain senators. A servant reports that documents are being smuggled out of the palace. Piece by piece, conversation by conversation, Antonia assembles a picture of the conspiracy, and the picture is worse than she thought. Silvanus has not just been planning a coup, he has already murdered Tiberius's son, Drusus, by poisoning him. He has married into the imperial family to legitimize his claim. He's positioning his most loyal troops in key locations. He is ready to move. The conspiracy is not in some distant future. It is happening now in the year 31. Can you imagine the fear? Antonia knows that if Sidonus succeeds, he will kill everyone who might challenge him. That includes her. That includes her children. That includes her grandchildren. She is sitting on information that could save the empire, but revealing it could get her entire family murdered. And she has to make a choice. This is what I find fascinating about Antonia. She is not a warrior queen like some of the women we have talked about. She does not command armies. She does not give dramatic speeches. She is quiet, careful, methodical, but she is also fearless when it matters. Because Antonia decides to tell Tiberius, she decides to blow the whistle on the most powerful man in Rome. But she cannot just send a normal message. Sejanus controls the Praetorian Guard. Any messenger could be intercepted. Any letter could be opened. So Antonia turns to the one person she trusts completely, her personal secretary, Keynes. We talked about Keynes in the last part, the enslaved woman with the perfect memory. And Antonia dictates everything. To her, every piece of evidence, every name, every meeting. Kenneth writes it all down in that crucial letter. But think about what Antonia is asking Kenneth to do. She is asking an enslaved woman to risk her life for the empire. If the letter is discovered, Kenneth will be tortured and killed. Antonia knows this, and she asks anyway because sometimes saving an empire requires asking people to make terrible sacrifices. And Keynes, loyal beyond measure, does it. She writes the letter. Then Antonia has to get the letter to Capri where Tiberius is hiding from the world. She sends Pallas, one of her most trusted, freed men. And here is the thing. If Pallas is caught, if the letter is found, not only will Pallas and Senus die, but Senus will move immediately. He will kill Antonia, kill Tiberius, and seize power. Everything depends on Pallas making it to that island. And he does. The letter reaches Tiberius, and we know what happens next because we covered it in the last part. Tiberius reads the letter. He finally sees the truth about Silvanus. He orders Silvanus arrested and executed. Thousands of conspirators are purged. Rome is saved from civil war. So what does Antonia get for saving the empire? What honors, what rewards, what public recognition? Here is where the story gets really interesting. After Silvanus is dead, after the conspiracy is crushed, Tiberius offers Antonia the title Augusta. This is the highest honor a Roman woman can receive. It is equivalent to empress. It comes with enormous prestige, public recognition, probably a lot of money. And Antonia says no. She refuses the honor. Why would she do that? Why would someone who just saved the empire turn down public recognition? I think there are a few reasons. First, Antonia was old-school Roman in her values. She believed in modesty, in serving the state without seeking glory. Second, accepting the title Augusta would have a more visible target. It would have put her children and grandchildren in more danger by making them seem like imperial heirs. And third, I think Antonia understood something profound. Real power is not about titles. It is about being essential. It is about being the person everyone needs. And she was essential. Even after the Sedinus affair, Antonia remained one of the most important people in Rome. When her grandson Caligula became emperor in the year 37, she was one of his key advisors, at least at first. Caligula even put her image on coins, which was extremely rare for a woman who was not empress. But Caligula, being Caligula, eventually turned on her. He humiliated her. He ignored her counsel, and according to some sources, he may have even had her killed in the year 37, though the details are murky. She was about 72 years old. But Antonia's influence did not end with her death. Her son Claudius, the one everyone thought was an idiot because he had a limp and a stutter, became emperor in the year 41. And Claudius, who everyone underestimated, turned out to be one of the more competent emperors. He conquered Britain. He improved the administration. He built aqueducts and harbors. And where did he learn politics? Where did he learn to survive? In the imperial court. From his mother, from Antonia. Claudius never forgot what Antonia taught him. He never forgot that she was the one who kept him safe through multiple regime changes. He deified her after her death, making her a goddess in the Roman pantheon. He put her image on coins. He built temples to her. But even that could not make the larger world remember her. Because here is the tragic truth. Antonia Minor saved the Roman Empire in one of its most dangerous moments, and history barely remembers her. She prevented a coup that would have plunged Rome into civil war. She protected the imperial succession. She raised an emperor. She was connected to more power than almost any woman in history. And if you ask most people today who saved Rome from Caesar, they will not know the answer. They might mention Tiberius. They might mention the senators who carried out the arrest. But Antonia, the woman who actually uncovered the plot, forgotten. Why? I think it is the same pattern we keep seeing. Women who operated behind the scenes, who did not command armies or give public speeches, who wielded power through intelligence and relationships rather than force. They get written out of history. Their stories do not fit the narrative of how power is supposed to work. They're too subtle, too quiet, too complicated. But there is also something specific about whistleblowers. Throughout history, people who expose wrongdoing, who speak truth to power, they often get forgotten or worse. Because whistleblowing makes people uncomfortable. It reveals that the system is not working the way it is supposed to. It shows that corruption and conspiracy can happen at the highest levels, and societies do not like being reminded of that. So they forget the whistleblowers. They erase the messengers who brought bad news even when those messengers saved everything. Think about modern parallels. How many whistleblowers can you name who were later celebrated and honored during their lifetimes? Not many. Most of them face retaliation, exile, or obscurity. Antonia faced the same thing 2,000 years ago. She risked everything. She saved the empire. She refused public credit, and then she was forgotten. But she mattered. She changed history. And every time we tell the story of how Sejanus fell, we should remember that it was Antonia who made it happen. It was her network of informants, her careful documentation, her courage to speak out, her willingness to risk her family for the greater good. That is heroism. It just does not look like the heroism we're used to seeing in history books. So far, we have met 5 women, one who shaped an empire through decades of patience and intelligence, one who saved an empire through courage in a single crisis, one who ran an empire for 23 years while men took credit, one who saved an empire despite being enslaved, and now one who saved an empire by being the bravest whistleblower in history. 5 different paths to power, 5 different ways of being essential, 5 stories that history tried to erase. But here is where we shift gears slightly, because all the women we have met so far, they were at least free. They had some agency, some choice in their actions. But what about the women who are not just overlooked by history, but who are actively serving the men who get all the credit? What about the women who quite literally made empires function, while their husbands went off to fight wars? We're about to meet someone whose job description was basically run the largest empire in human history while he is away for years. And I promise you, her story will change how you think about how empires actually worked. Stay with me. Here is something I bet you have never thought about. Who actually ran the Mongol Empire? When you hear Genghis Khan, you picture a warrior on horseback conquering everything from Korea to Hungary. You imagine armies, battles, the thunder of thousands of horses. But here is the question nobody asks. While Genghis Khan was away fighting for 5 years, 10 years, sometimes longer, who was managing the homeland? Who was coordinating the seasonal migrations of hundreds of thousands of people and millions of animals? Who was making sure the economy did not collapse, that trade routes stayed open, that commanders had the resources they needed? The answer is a 17-year-old woman you have probably never heard of. Her name was Berta, and I'm about to completely change how you understand the Mongol Empire, because the conquest part, the part everyone talks about, that was actually the easier part. The hard part was keeping everything running back home, and that job belonged to her. Let me take you back to around the year 1178. Imagine the steppes of Mongolia, this vast ocean of grass stretching farther than you can see in any direction. The Mongol tribes are scattered, constantly fighting each other, forming and breaking alliances. And there is a young man, maybe 16 years old, named Temujin. He's not Genghis Khan yet. He's just a kid from a minor clan trying to survive in a brutal world where his father has been murdered and his family has been abandoned by their tribe, and Temujin is betrothed to a girl named Berta. This is not a love match, this is politics. Their fathers arranged it when they were children. But when Temujin finally shows up to claim his bride, something interesting happens. The sources suggest that Berta and Temujin actually connect. They like each other. There is respect there, maybe even affection. And they get married when Berta is maybe 16 or 17 years old. Now, here is where the story gets really intense. And I need to tell you this part because it reveals something crucial about who Bura was. Shortly after their marriage, maybe within the first year, Bertie is kidnapped by a rival tribe called the Merkits. This is retaliation for something Temujin's father did years earlier, and the Merkits take Bertie as a captive. She's gone for months, maybe close to a year, and during that time, she's forced to become the wife of one of her captors. Temujin assembles an alliance. He calls in every favor he has. He gets help from his blood brother Jamuka and from a powerful chief named Togrul, and they raid the Merkits, rescue Berta, and bring her home. But when she comes back, she is pregnant and nobody knows for sure if the child is Temujin's or her captor's. Now this moment could have destroyed everything. In many cultures at that time, Temujin would have been expected to reject Berta, to cast her out as damaged goods. But he does not do that. Instead, Temujin makes a decision that is absolutely critical to everything that follows. He accepts Berta back completely. He claims the child, a son named Yi, as his own. He treats Berta as his chief wife, his most important partner, and Berta, she survives kidnapping, probable assault, pregnancy and captivity, and comes back stronger. She does not break. She does not disappear into obscurity. She becomes the foundation of the Mongol Empire. Because that is what I want you to understand. Berta was not just some woman in the background. She was a political and economic powerhouse. Let me explain how Mongol society worked, because it is different from what you might expect. When Mongol men went on campaigns, they were often gone for years, not months, years. They would ride thousands of miles away, fighting in China or Persia or Central Asia. And while they were gone, who managed everything? The women. Mongol women had far more authority than their counterparts in Europe, in China, in the Middle East, pretty much anywhere else at that time. Women in Mongol society could own property independently. They could make economic decisions. They could command servants and even soldiers if necessary. They could speak in councils. They could ride horses and use weapons if needed. And most importantly, they were expected to manage the entire household economy while the men were away. This was not symbolic. This was real power. And Berta was at the top of this system. When Temujin started becoming Genghis Khan, when he started uniting the Mongol tribes in the late 1100s and early 1200s, Bura was managing his home base. She had her own ord, which is basically a mobile household camp. Think of it like a small city made of yurts, but it moves with the seasons, and Bura was responsible for everything. Let me give you a sense of scale here. We're not talking about managing a household of 10 or 20 people. Berta's Ordo probably had thousands of people. Servants, warriors, craftsmen, herders, their families, and hundreds of thousands of animals, horses, sheep, cattle, goats, camels. This was a massive economic enterprise, and it was constantly moving because Mongol society was nomadic. They had to migrate seasonally to find fresh pasture for the animals. Can you imagine coordinating that? Imagine being responsible for moving thousands of people and their livestock across hundreds of miles, making sure everyone has enough food and water, making sure the animals do not get sick, making sure you arrive at the right places at the right times. It is like being the logistics coordinator for a moving city. And Berta did this year after year. But it was not just logistics. Berta also had political and diplomatic responsibilities. Commanders would check in with her before going to meet Genghis Khan. Ambassadors from other tribes or nations would sometimes meet with her first. If merchants wanted to trade with the Mongols, they often had to get Bura's approval. She was a gateway to power, and people knew it. The sources also make it clear that Genghis Khan consulted Berti on major decisions. This was not unusual in Mongol culture. Men were expected to consult their wives, especially their chief wife, on important matters. And Genghis Khan valued Bura's judgment. She had survived incredible trauma. She had proven her loyalty and capability. He trusted her completely, and Bura gave Genghis Khan 4 sons who survived to adulthood: Yi, Chagatai, Ogadei, and Tolui. Remember Tui? That is Sakatani's husband, the father of the 4 sons who all became emperors. So Berta was not just managing the empire in the present. She was raising the next generation of rulers. And she was doing it while Genghis Khan was away conquering China and Central Asia. Think about what this means. While Genghis Khan is off fighting the Jin dynasty, which takes years, Berta is making sure that the Mongol homeland stays stable, that resources keep flowing to the armies, that alliances with various tribes stay intact, that trade continues. She is essentially the chief operating officer of the largest military enterprise in the world at that time. And here is the thing that historians often miss. Conquest is actually the easy part of empire building. Seriously, conquering is straightforward. You have a bigger army, better tactics, you win. But administering, keeping millions of people fed, maintaining economic production, preserving social stability, that is infinitely harder. And that is what Bura was doing. There is a reason the Mongol Empire did not collapse while Genghis Khan was away for years at a time. It is because he had left the homeland in incredibly capable hands. Bert made sure that when Genghis Khan came back from a campaign, he had a functioning base to return to, supplies, waiting, fresh horses, new recruits trained, diplomatic relationships maintained. I want you to compare this to what was happening in Europe at the same time. In the early 1200s, European queens had almost no independent political power. They were symbols, they bore heirs, they might serve as regents for underage sons, but independent administrative authority, no. If a European king left for a crusade for several years, the kingdom would often descend into chaos with various nobles, fighting for control. But the Mongol Empire, it kept functioning smoothly, and a big part of that was the structure Mongol women created. They had real jobs, real responsibilities, real authority. And Berta was the model for this. She was setting the example that other Mongol noble women would follow. Now, here is where I want to push back on something. Some modern historians have tried to argue that Berta's power was exaggerated, that she was just a symbolic figure. But the sources do not support that. The Persian historian Juvenal, who wrote in the 13th century, explicitly describes how Mongol noble women managed their orders and made important decisions. The Chinese sources also acknowledge the authority of Mongol women. Even European visitors to the Mongol Empire, people like William of Rub, were shocked by how much power Mongol women had compared to European women, and we have practical evidence. The Mongol system worked. The empire did not fall apart during campaigns. Resources reached the armies. The economy functioned. That does not happen by accident. That happens because someone extremely competent was managing things, and in the Mongol homeland, that someone was primarily Berta. There is also the question of military involvement. Some sources suggest that Mongol women, including Berta, occasionally fought in battles. Now, we need to be careful here because the sources are not totally clear. But what we do know is that Mongol women knew how to ride and shoot. They was trained in these skills from childhood, and in desperate situations they could and did fight. Recent archaeological work has found that about 20% of Mongol warrior graves contain female skeletons with weapons. 20%. That is not insignificant. Did Berta personally fight in battles? We do not know for sure, but she absolutely could have if necessary. She had the skills, she had the authority, and she lived in a culture where that was not considered weird or shocking. It was just practical. Now, I want to talk about something else that is really important. Berta's sons. Because raising kids is always seen as this domestic private thing, right? But Bora was not just raising kids. She was raising future emperors. And the way she raised them, the values she instilled, the skills she made sure they learned, all of that shaped the Mongol Empire for generations. We know that Bora was heavily involved in her sons' education. She made sure they learned military skills, obviously, but also administration, diplomacy, how to manage people, how to maintain alliances, and perhaps most importantly, she taught them to value capable women. All four of her sons had wives who wielded significant power. Tui married Sorghakani, who we talked about in part 1. The other sons also had influential wives. That pattern came from Berta. She modeled what a powerful, capable woman looked like, and her sons grew up expecting their wives to be partners, not subordinates. There was also the question of succession. After Genghis Khan died in 1227, there could have been a civil war over who would succeed him. Yoki, the eldest son, had already died, but Chagatai, Ugadai, and Tului could have fought each other. Instead, they followed the plan Genghis Khan and Berta had established. Ugadai became the great Khan, and that succession held at least initially, because Berta had raised her sons to respect the family structure, to value unity over individual ambition. Do you see the pattern here? Everything that made the Mongol Empire successful, the things that made it different from other empires, a lot of that came from the administrative and social structures that women like Berta built. The economic management, the diplomatic networks, the succession planning, the emphasis on practical competence over rigid hierarchy. Women were central to all of that. But when we tell the story of the Mongol Empire, we focus on the conquests. We talk about the TTLEs, the strategies, the military innovations, and those are important, but they are only half the story. The other half is the administrative machinery that made those conquests possible, and that machinery was largely built and operated by women. Berta died sometime in the early 1230s, probably around 1232 or 1233. She would have been in her early 7 seconds, which was quite old for that time, and when she died she was still one of the most respected figures in the Mongol Empire. Her sons revered her, other noble women looked to her as an example. She had lived through the entire rise of the empire, from when her husband was just an ambitious tribal leader to when her sons ruled the largest land empire in history. And then history forgot her. When you read about the Mongol Empire, you get chapters about Genghis Khan's military campaigns, about the conquest of China, about the destruction of Khwarizm, about the raids into Europe. You get maybe a paragraph about Berta, if that she becomes Genghis Khan's wife, reduced to a supporting character in someone else's story, but she was not a supporting character. She was the chief administrator of the Mongol homeland for decades. She was a political leader, an economic manager, a diplomat, and possibly a warrior. She was essential to everything the Mongol Empire achieved, and she modeled a form of female power that would influence Mongol society for generations. And here is what really gets me. We do this all the time. We focus on the dramatic stuff, the violence and conquest, and we ignore the hard, unsexy work of administration. We valorize the people who break things and ignore the people who build things and keep things running. We remember the warriors and forget the managers. And because administrative work in the Mongol Empire was often done by women, we have essentially written women out of the story. But the Mongols underst. OD something that many other societies did not. Conquest without administration is just destruction. You can conquer all the territory you want, but if you cannot govern it, if you cannot keep it functioning, it will fall apart immediately. And the Mongols were actually really good at governing their conquered territories, at least initially. They were pragmatic, they were flexible, they incorporated local systems when they worked, and a lot of that administrative philosophy came from the way Mongol women ran their ordos. Bura proved that you could manage a massive, complex, mobile society effectively. She proved that women could wield real political and economic power. She proved that partnership between men and women, where both had important roles and respected each other's competence, could be incredibly successful. And then historians decided that none of that was interesting enough to write about. We have now met 6 women, an intelligence mastermind who shaped an empire through her sons, a courage personified who saved an empire in its darkest hour, a Syrian administrator who ran Rome while emperors fought, an enslaved woman whose memory saved an emperor, a whistleblower who exposed the greatest conspiracy, and now a 17-year-old bride who became the operational backbone of history's largest land empire. But what about the women who were explicitly told they could not rule, who faced direct opposition to their power and yet managed to shape empires anyway? What about the women who were so controversial that even contemporary sources could not decide if they were heroes or villains? We're about to meet someone like that, and trust me, her story is going to challenge everything you think about ambition, power, and how history judges women who refuse to stay in their assigned roles. Stay with me. What if I told you that 2 women did almost exactly the same thing in same empire at roughly the same time, but one was praised as the wisest woman in the world, while the other was condemned as corrupt and power-hungry? What if the only real difference between them was how male historians chose to write about them? This is the story of a woman who ruled the Mongol Empire for 5 years, navigated one of the most dangerous succession crises in history, and was thanked by having her reputation destroyed for centuries. Her name was Turaga Khatun, and her story is going to make you really angry about how history treats ambitious women. Let me start with a comparison that will blow your mind. We talked about Sagakane, Becky, in part 1, right? The brilliant woman who maneuvered her sons into power, who refused remarriage to protect her interests, who manipulated succession politics to get her son Munker elected as Great Khan. The Historians loved her. They called her wise, shrewd, the most intelligent woman in the world. They praised her political skills. Now meet Turan Khatun. She also refused Rimaraj to protect her interests. She also maneuvered to get her son elected as great Khn. She also served as regent during a succession crisis. She also made and broke alliances to consolidate power. And the same historians who praised Sorghakani, they absolutely trashed her again. They called her corrupt, vindictive, power-hungry. They said she was a disaster for the empire. Same actions, different reputations. And the question we have to ask is why? What was actually different? Or is this just naked sexism dressed up as historical analysis? Turan Khatun was born sometime in the late 1100s, probably around 1180 or 1190. She came from the Naimon people, another nomadic group in Central Asia. And like many noble women in that region, she was married off for political reasons. She became the wife of Ugh Khan, the third son of Genghis Khan, the one who was chosen to succeed his father as great Khn. Now Ugay had multiple wives. This was normal in Mongol society. But Turajena was not his chief wife. She was actually his fifth wife. But here is the thing. She had 5 sons with Ugay, including Guk, and in Mongol society, having sons gave you political weight. It gave you influence. And Turagana was smart, politically savvy, and ambitious. She knew how to work the system. Urgad became great Khn in 1229, 2 years after Genghis Khan died. And he was actually a pretty decent ruler. He expanded the empire. He set up administrative systems. He was known for being generous, maybe too generous. He liked to drink, probably too much. But he kept the empire running. And Turaga was there watching, learning, building her own networks. Then in 1241, Ugaday dies suddenly. He's only about 55 years old. Some sources suggest he drank himself to death, though the exact cause is unclear. And suddenly the Mongol Empire has a massive problem: succession. Who becomes the next great Khn? Now, Ugay had apparently wanted his grandson, Shiran, to succeed him. Shiran was the son of Ugaday's deceased eldest son, so that would keep the succession in the direct line. But there was a problem. Shiran was young, maybe in his early 22nd, and not particularly strong politically. He did not have a powerful base of support. And then there was Guk Turan's son, older, more experienced, already a military commander. He had led campaigns, he had his own supporters, and he had something crucial, a mother who was absolutely determined to see him on the throne. According to Mongol tradition, when a great Khn died, a Kurultai had to be convened. This was a grand assembly of all the important nobles and princes. They would debate and eventually elect the next Khn. But organizing a Kur took time. Princes had to travel from all across the massive empire. Some were in Ina, some in Persia, some in Russia. Gathering, everyone could take months or even years. And in the meantime, someone had to run the empire. That someone was Turan. She became regent, and she would hold that position for 5 years, from 1241 to 1246. 5 years. That is longer than many emperors' entire reigns. Now here is where the historical sources start getting really biased. The two main historians who write about this period are Juvani and Rashid Alin. These are the same historians who praised Sorgtani, and they absolutely savaged her. Again, they claim she was corrupt, that she sold government positions, that she was vindictive and pursued personal vendettas, that she elevated incompetent people because they were loyal to her. But let me ask you something. Is that description unique to Turan, or is that just how power politics works? When male rulers purge their opponents and reward their supporters, we call that consolidating power or securing the throne. When Turan does it, it is corruption and personal vendettas. Do you see the double standard? Let me give you specifics. Juveni writes that Turigan, having been offended by certain persons during the Khn's reign, and these Feelings of resentment rooted in her heart, she resolved now that she was an absolute ruler to wreak vengeance upon each of these persons. Okay, so she removed people from power who had opposed her or her family. That is literally what every successful ruler does. You cannot maintain power if you leave your enemies in positions of authority. Rashid Aline writes that she was a very shrewd and capable woman, but then spends pages detailing how she supposedly mismanaged the empire. And yet, here is the thing. The empire did not collapse under her regency. There was no major rebellion. The economy kept functioning. The military campaigns continued. If she was such a disaster, how did the empire stay stable for 5 years? I think what was really happening is this. Turagan was doing exactly what she needed to do to secure her son's succession, and the male historians could not stand it. They could praise Sorgtani for the same behavior because Sagani fit their image of the ideal woman, modest, devoted to her children, seemingly not pursuing power for its own sake. Turagan was more blatant about it. She wanted power. She used power, she enjoyed power, and that made the historians uncomfortable. Let me tell you what Turan actually accomplished during her regency. First, she built a coalition of support for Guyuk. She reached out to various princes and nobles. She made promises, formed alliances, offered incentives. This is called politics. Every ruler does this. But when she does it, it is portrayed as scheming. Second, she managed the administration of the empire. She appointed governors, handled the treasury, maintained diplomatic relations with neighboring states. The sources admit, sometimes grudgingly, that she was capable at this. Wayne even says she had unity and concord in her administration, so she was doing the job well, but somehow that is not good enough. Third, she delayed the Kurultai strategically. Now her critics say she delayed it because she was clinging to power. But think about this politically. If she called the Kurai too soon before she had secured enough support for Gu, he might lose. Then all her work would be for nothing, and probably her and Guk would be sidelined or killed. So she waited. She built support. She made sure that when the cruelty finally happened, Guk would win. And you know what? It worked. In 1246, the Kurai finally convened and Gu was elected Great Khn. Turan had successfully maneuvered her son onto the throne of the largest empire in the world. That is not corruption. That is political genius. But here is where the story gets complicated. Guke did not have a great relationship with his mother. As soon as he became Khn, he started undermining her power. He removed some of Herber appointees. He asserted his independence. This is actually pretty common. Sons who become rulers often need to distance themselves from their mothers to establish their own authority. But it is telling that the sources portray this as Guk correcting his mother's mistakes rather than just normal political maneuvering. Gu also did not get along with Sorganiber and her family. There was bad blood between the descendants of Ogodai Ambra, the descendants of Tui. This would eventually lead to civil war after Guk's death. But during the Kurultaiber in 1246, Turagan and Sorgakani worked together. They had to. And the sources make it clear that both women were instrumental in making the cruelty function, in preventing violence, in brokering the election. So here we have these two powerful women, both regents, but both manipulating succession, both building coalitions, both exercising real power. And the historians praise one and condemn the other. Why? I think there are a few reasons. First, hindsight bias. Sorgtani's sons went on to have very successful reigns. Monka and Kubli expanded the empire to its greatest extent, so historians retroactively decided that Sorgakani must have been wise. Guk, on the other hand, only ruled for 2 years before dying. He did not accomplish much. So historians decided Turan must have been bad. But that is not fair. Turan cannot control how long her son lived. Second, narrative convenience. Historians needed a villain in this period. They needed someone to blame for the instability and infighting. Turan became that scapegoat. it is easier to say this woman was corrupt than to acknowledge the structural problems in Mongol succession that made civil war almost inevitable. Third, and I think this is the big Saint 1. Turigan was too visibly ambitious. She did not pretend to be reluctant about power. She did not hide behind her son. She ruled openly, directly, unapologetically, and that violated the historians' expectations of how women should behave. Even powerful women were supposed to be modest, to claim they were acting for others, to downplay their own ambition. Turan did not do that, and she was punished for it in the historical record. Can you imagine if we applied this standard to male rulers? If we condemned every emperor who pursued power ambition, who removed opponents, who delayed elections until they had secured support, we would have to condemn almost every successful ruler in history. But we do not. We say they were strong, decisive, politically savvy. But when a woman does it, corrupt, vindictive, power-hungry. And here is the really insidious part. This double standard still affects us today. When we read these medieval sources, we tend to take them at face value. We assume the historians were accurately describing what happened. But they were not. They were writing with their own biases, their own agenda, and their agenda included keeping women in their place, making sure that even powerful women were not seen as legitimate rulers in their own right. So what is the truth about Turigan? I think the truth is that she was a capable, ambitious politician who successfully navigated one of the most dangerous periods in Mongol history. She kept the empire stable for 5 years. She maneuvered her son onto the throne. She made the hard decisions that needed to be made. And yes, she probably did remove opponents and reward allies, because that is what you have to do to survive in that environment. Was she perfect? Of course not. Did she make mistakes? Probably. Did some of her appointees turn out to be incompetent? Maybe. But show me a ruler who did not have those problems. Show me a Malabar regent who did not face the same challenges and make the same compromises. The more I study Turan, the more I see her as a tragic figure. She did everything right according to the rules of the game. She played Mongol power politics brilliantly. She achieved her goal, and her reward was to have her reputation destroyed by historians. Huber could not accept that a woman could be that politically capable and that openly ambitious. And this matters because it is not just about one woman in the 13th century. This pattern repeats throughout history. Ambitious women are judged more harshly than ambitious men. Women who pursue power are seen as corrupt or unnatural. Women who do not apologize for their ambition are condemned. And then, centuries later, we read those condemnations and assume they must be true. We do not question the bias in Theber sources. So let me be clear. Turan Khatun was not a villain. She was not corrupt. She was not a disaster for the Mongol Empire. She was a skilled political operator who ruled effectively during a crisis, who secured her son's succession, and who was then scapegoated by historians who needed someone to blame her for problems that were much bigger than any one person. And if you're sitting there thinking, but maybe she really was corrupt, ask yourself, would you think that if the exact same actions were performed by a man, if a male regent had done everything Turigan did, would you question his motives, or would you admire his political skill? Be honest, with yourself. We have now met 7 women. Each one saved or shaped Anbar Empire. Each one exercised real power, and each one has been erased, minimized or demonized by history. But we are not done yet, because some of the most dramatic stories are still to come. What about the woman who was not just criticized, but who actually went to war to defend her empire? What about the woman who became a king, not a queen, because queen was not enough? That story is next, and it is going to be epic. Stay with me. There are titles that limit you, and then there are titles that liberate you. In medieval Europe, when a woman ruled, she was called queen, and that word came with expectations. Queens were supposed to be gentle, pious, decorative. They were supposed to bear heirs and stay out of politics. But in the Kingdom of Georgia in the late 12th century, there was a woman who refused that limitation. She demanded to be called king, Not queen, king, because king meant real power, and she intended to use it. Her name was Tamar, and over the course of 29 years from 1184 to 1213, she turned Georgia into the most powerful state in the Caucasus, defeated multiple invasions, expanded her territory to its largest extent ever, and presided over a golden age of culture and prosperity. And she did all of this while being constantly challenged because of her gender. Her story is going to make you wonder why we do not talk about her more, because honestly, she was extraordinary. Let me set the stage for you. The year is 1160. Tamar is born to King George III of Georgia. Now, Georgia in the 12th century is not the country you might know today. It is a kingdom in the Caucasus region, sitting between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, bordered by Muslim powers to the south and Christian Byzantium to the west. It is strategically located, wealthy from trade, routes, and constantly under pressure from larger neighbors. King George III is a strong ruler, but he has a problem: political rivals. Specifically, he has a nephew named Demner, who some nobles think should be king instead of George. And in 1177, these nobles actually rebel. They try to put Demner on the throne. George crushes the rebellion, and then he does something absolutely brutal. He has Demner castrated and blinded. Evil politics were not subtle. But now George has another problem. He has no male heir. His only surviving child is his daughter Tamar. And Georgia has never had a female ruler. Never. So, George makes a radical decision in 1178 when Tamar is about 18 years old. He crowns her as his co-ruler, not as a princess, not as an heir in waiting, as an actual Koman with real authority. This is unprecedented, and George is doing it strategically. He knows that when he dies there will be resistance to Tamar ruling alone. So he is getting the nobles and clergy used to the idea now while he is still alive to back her up. It is brilliant, but it is also risky because the nobles are not happy about this. And then in 1184, George dies. Tamar is 24 years old, and now she has to rule alone, and immediately there is opposition. A powerful faction of nobles basically says we cannot have a woman ruling us. It is unnatural. It is against tradition. We need a man on the throne. Now, how does Tamar handle this? Does she back down? Does she compromise? No, she doubles down. She has herself crowned again. A second coronation at the Galati Cathedral. And she makes it clear, I am not a regent. I am not a placeholder. I am the monarch. Deal with it. But to survive, she has to be smart. She cannot just assert authority and expect everyone to fall in line, so she makes a strategic compromise. The nobles want to feel like they have influence. Fine. She reorganizes the royal council, gives the great noble families more representation. She listens to their advice. She appears to be differential and pious, but she's also carefully choosing which advice to take and which to ignore. She's playing the game. The nobles also insist that she needs to get married. And here is where it gets interesting. They choose her husband for her. His name is Yuri Bogoliki. He is a Russian prince exiled from his homeland, and the Georgian nobles think he will be controllable. They think, okay, we will let Tamar be queen, but her husband will really be in charge, except it does not work out that way. Yuri turns out to be a capable military commander. He wins battles for Georgia, but he is also, according to the sources, a disaster as a person. The chronicles describe him as immoral, possibly abusive, definitely difficult to work with. And after about 2 years, Tamar makes another unprecedented decision. She divorces him. Now, in medieval Christian society, divorce is almost impossible, especially for royalty. Marriages are sacred, political, meant to be permanent. But Tamar gets the Georgian church to annul the marriage, and then she sends Yuri away. She's basically saying, I tried your choice of husband. It did not work. Now I am making my own decisions. And the nobles are furious. Yuri is furious. In fact, Yuri is so furious that he rebels against Tamar twice. He gets support from some Georgian nobles and tries to overthrow her militarily. And both times Tamar crushes his rebellion. The second time she captures him, and instead of executing him, she shows mercy and sends him away again. But the message is clear: you cannot push me around. Meanwhile, Tamar remarries, and this time she chooses her own husband, David Sosan. He is an Allen prince, a capable military commander, and importantly, someone who is willing to support Tamar, rather than try to overshadow her. And this marriage works. They have 2 children together, and David becomes one of her key generals, but he never tries to rule. Tamar remains the monarch. She's called king, and David is her consort. Now, let me tell you about the military campaigns, because this is where Tamar proves she is not just surviving but thriving. In 1195, the Sultan of the Seljuk Empire, the powerful Muslim state to the south, decides that Georgia needs to be taught a lesson. He invades with a massive army, and Tamar's forces, commanded by David Slen, meet them at the Battle of Shamor. The Georgians win decisively. They do not just repel the invasion, they destroy the Seljuk army, capture the Sultan's treasury, and take his personal banner. This is humiliating for the Seljuks and a huge victory for Georgia, and it establishes Georgia as a major military power in the region. Then in 1202, the Seljuk Sultan tries again. He invades with an even larger army. And once again, Georgian forces, this time at the Battle of Basani, win a crushing victory. The sources describe Georgian troops pursuing the fleeing Seljuks for miles, completely routing them. After Basani, the Seljuks basically give up trying to conquer Georgia. They switch to trying to maintain trade relationships instead. But Tamar does not stop there. She goes on the offensive. Georgian armies push south into Armenia, liberating Christian territories that had been under Muslim control. They push east, making Shioan a tributary state. They push into what is now eastern Turkey, capturing important cities. By the early 1200s, Georgia controls more territory than ever before in its history. Tamar's kingdom stretches from the Black Sea to the Caspian Sea, from the northern Caucasus Mountains down to what is now northern Iran. And here is what I find really interesting. The sources described Tamar accompanying her armies to the front. She did not fight in battles herself, at least not according to the records, but she was there at the camps showing support, making strategic decisions. This was unusual for medieval rulers, male or female. But Tamar understood the importance of being visible, of showing that she was personally invested in these campaigns. There is also a fascinating incident in 1205. A Seljuk Sultan invades Georgia and, according to the sources, he specifically cites Tamar's gender as his justification. He basically says, "You cannot have a woman ruling. This weakens your kingdom. We're going to conquer you because you are led by a female." And Tamar's response, she crushes his invasion. She proves that gender has nothing to do with military competence or political strength. But Tamar was not just about military conquest. She understood that a great kingdom needs more than just armies. It needs culture, learning, art, infrastructure. And under her rule, Georgia experiences what historians call its golden age. Churches and monasteries are built across the kingdom, many with stunning fresco and architecture that still exist today. The most famous is probably her own monument, the church at Vadzia, carved into the side of a mountain. Literature flourishes. The greatest work of Georgian literature, The Knight in the Panther's Skin by Shoto Rustelli, is written during Tamar's reign and dedicated to her. This epic poem becomes the defining text of Georgian culture. Tamar also supports education, religious, scholarship, and the arts. The royal treasury is full, and she uses that wealth to patronize culture. And then in 1204, Tamar does something really clever. The Fourth Crusade has just sacked Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire is in chaos, and Tamar sees an opportunity. She has two nephews, Alexios and David, who are Byzantine princes who were raised at her court after their family lost power, and Tamar decides to help them establish a new empire. She sends Georgian troops, along with her nephews, to the Black Sea coast, and they establish the empire of Trebizond. This becomes an independent state loyal to Georgia, giving Tamar a crucial ally and a port on the Black Sea. It is a brilliant strategic move. She expands. Her influence without direct conquest creates a buffer state and helps Christian princes who were loyal to her. The empire of Trebizond will actually survive longer than the Byzantine Empire itself, lasting until 1461. So by the end of Tamar's reign, Georgia is at its peak. It is the dominant power in the Caucasus. It is wealthy, culturally vibrant, militarily strong. Her kingdom is described by contemporary sources as stretching from sea to sea, and Tamar herself is called King of Kings and Queen of Queens. That title is important. King of Kings is the highest title in the region, traditionally reserved for the most powerful ruler. Tamar claims it and nobody can dispute it because she has earned it through conquest and diplomacy. But here is what really fascinates me. Why was Tamar called king and not queen? The Georgian sources consistently use the masculine title Meep, which means king, and I think there are a few reasons. First, practically queen in that context implied a consort, the wife of a king. Tamar was not anyone's wife in terms of power. She was the monarch, so queen would have diminished her authority. Second, king carried weight. It meant military command, judicial authority, diplomatic power. It meant everything that rulership entailed, and Tamar demanded all of that authority, not a lesser feminine version of it. Third, and I think this is crucial, by calling herself king, Tamar was making a statement: gender is irrelevant to leadership. The title describes the function, not the person's sex. She was saying, I do everything a king does, therefore I am a king. It is a radical assertion of equality. And the remarkable thing is that it worked. By the end of her reign, nobody was seriously challenging her authority based on gender. She had proven herself too thoroughly. She had won too many battles, expanded the kingdom too much, brought too much prosperity. The Georgian people and nobles came to see her as legitimate, not despite being a woman, but just as their ruler, period. Tamar died in 1213. She was only about 53 years old, and she left the throne to her son, George IV. She had secured the succession. She'd created a stable, powerful kingdom. She had achieved everything a medieval ruler could hope to achieve. And then just 20 years after her death, the Mongols arrived in Georgia, and everything Tamar built was destroyed. The Mongols conquered Georgia, made it a tributary state, extracted tribute, killed thousands. The Golden Age ended, the territory shrank, the prosperity evaporated, and in some ways this makes Tamar's achievements even more poignant. She built something beautiful and powerful, and it was swept away by forces beyond anyone's control. But for 29 years, Georgia under Tamar was extraordinary. So why do more people not know about her? Georgia is a small country often overlooked in Western historical narratives. Her story does not fit neatly into the frameworks we use to teach history. She's not Roman, not Chinese, not Islamic, not quite European. She exists in this in-between space that often gets ignored, and maybe there is also the discomfort of acknowledging that a medieval Christian kingdom at a time when European women had almost no political power had a female king who was more successful than most male rulers. But in Georgia, Tamar is a national hero. She's considered a saint by the Georgian Orthodox Church. Her face is on currency. She's celebrated in literature, art, music. Georgians know her story. The rest of the world, not so much. And that is a shame, because Tamar's story has so much to teach us. She teaches us that gender is not a barrier to leadership if you are competent and determined. She teaches us that titles matter because they shape how people perceive you. She teaches us that you can honor traditions while also breaking them. She teaches us that mercy and strength are not opposites. She teaches us that building is as important as conquering. We have now met 8 women. Each one saved or shaped an empire. Each one overcame enormous obstacles, and each one deserves to be remembered. But we still have 4 more stories to go. And next, we're going to meet someone who did not just exercise power, but who literally chose who would be emperor. Someone who might have changed the course of Roman history through one act that may or may not have been forgery. This one is going to make you question everything you think you know about historical truth. Stay with me. Imagine, you are the Emperor of Rome. You are dying, and you know that who you name as your successor will determine the fate of the empire for decades to come. So you make your choice. You tell your wife, and you die. A few hours later, your wife announces your choice to the world. Simple, right? Except here is the question. Did you actually make that choice? Or did your wife just put words in your dead mouth to install the emperor she wanted? That is the mystery, at the heart of one of the most important successions in Roman history, the year 117. Emperor Trajan, one of Rome's greatest rulers, dies suddenly while on campaign, and his wife, Empress Plutina, announces that with his dying breath, he named his cousin Hadrian as his successor. Hadrian becomes emperor and goes on to have one of the most successful reigns in Roman history. But did Trajan really name him, or did Plutina stage manage the whole thing? We will never know for sure. And that uncertainty tells us something fascinating about where real power actually lived in ancient Rome. Let me introduce you to Plutina. She was born sometime around the year 70, probably in the Roman province of Gallia Narbonensis, which is modern southern France. She came from a wealthy provincial family, well-educated, cultured, connected, and she married a man named Marcus Ulpius Traianus, who we know as Trajan. This is before he becomes emperor. He's just a successful military officer with a good career ahead of him. Now, Trajan comes from Hispania, modern Spain. So we have this couple, both from the provinces, not from the old Roman aristocracy, and they rise together. Trajan becomes more and more successful. He gains the favor of Emperor Nerva, and in the year 98, Nerva adopts Trajan as his son and heir. When Nerva dies just a few months later, Trajan becomes emperor, and Plutina becomes empress. And here is where Plutina reveals herself to be more than just an emperor's wife. She uses her position to wield real influence. She corresponds with philosophers and intellectuals. She patronizes the arts. She involves herself in imperial appointments. She advises Trajan on policy. Contemporary sources make it clear that Trajan valued her opinion, that he consulted with her on important matters. But Plutina had a favorite, a young man named Publius Aelius Hadrianus. We know him as Hadrian, and this is where the story gets really interesting. Hadrian was Trajan's distant cousin. He came from the same hometown in Spain. He was smart, cultured, loved Greek art and philosophy, showed military promise, and Plutina absolutely adored him. The sources suggest that Plutina saw something special in Hadrian from early on. She became his patron, his advocate, at court. She pushed Trajan to give Hadrian important positions to advance his career, and Trajan did give Hadrian opportunities. Hadrian served in various military and administrative roles. He was clearly talented. But here is the thing. Trajan did not seem to like Hadrian very much. The ancient sources hint at this. Trajan thought Hadrian was too Greek in his tastes, too intellectual, not Roman enough. Trajan was a soldier's soldier, practical, direct. Hadrian was cultured, artistic, philosophical. They were just very different people, and Trajan had doubts about whether Hadrian would make a good emperor. So, who did Trajan want as his successor? That is not entirely clear. He never publicly named an heir during his lifetime, which was actually pretty irresponsible given that he ruled for 19 years. He had no children of his own. There were other relatives who could have been chosen, But Trajan kept his plans to himself, if he even had definite plans. Now fast forward to August of 117. Trajan is on a military campaign in the east trying to conquer Parthia, modern Iran, and Iraq. The campaign is not going well, and Trajan, who is about 63 years old, suffers a stroke. He is suddenly very ill. He starts trying to return to Rome, but he only makes it as far as the city of Selinus in southern Turkey. And there on August 8th or 9th, Trajan dies. And this is where everything gets suspicious. Plotina is with Trajan when he dies. She has been traveling with him on the campaign, just like Julia Domer did with Septimius Sais decades later. So she is there in that city when Trajan has his stroke and dies. And within hours an announcement goes out. Emperor Trajan, with his final words, has adopted Hadrian and named him as successor. Now on the surface this seems straightforward. The emperor made a deathbed adoption and succession. Okay. But let me tell you why some people at the time and many historians since have suspected that this was actually a fabrication. First, the timing is suspicious. Why did Trajan wait until literally his dying moments to name a successor? He'd been sick for days. He knew he was dying. Why not make the adoption official earlier, when witnesses could verify it, when documents could be properly drawn up? Deathbed announcements are convenient because they cannot be verified. The only witnesses are the people right there in the room. Second, who was in that room? Plotina, certainly, possibly a few close advisors, but Hadrian himself was not there. He was actually in Syria, serving as governor. So he was hundreds of miles away when Trajan supposedly named him successor. That means the only people who could confirm what Trajan said were Plotina and whoever else she allowed in the room. Third, there is a really weird detail in one of the ancient sources. The historian Cassius Dio, writing about a century later, explicitly says that some people believed Plotina concealed Trajan's death for several days. According to this story, after Trajan died, Plotina pretended he was still alive but too sick to see anyone. And during those days, she forged the adoption documents and the succession announcement. Then, she finally revealed that Chan had died, but not before he had named Hrian. Now Dio says he does not know if this story is true. He is just reporting what some people believed. But the fact that this rumor existed at all tells you that people at the time were suspicious. They thought Plotina was capable of this level of deception. Fourth, consider the handwriting. Imperial adoptions and successions required formal documents properly witnessed and sealed. But in the case of Hadrian's adoption, there were questions about the authenticity of the documents. Some sources hint that the handwriting did not look quite right, that maybe someone had forged Tron's signature. Now, this could just be gossip from political opponents, but it is another piece of the suspicious puzzle. So, what actually happened? Let me give you the two main theories and you can decide which one you believe. Theory 1, Trajan really did name Hadrian. Maybe he came around to Plotina's view in his final days. Maybe he realized that Hadrian, despite their differences, was actually the best choice for the empire. Maybe he made the adoption official on his deathbed, and Plotina simply announced what had actually happened. This is the traditional official version of events. Theory 2, Plotina fabricated the whole thing. She knew Trajan was dying. She knew he had not named a successor. She knew that without a clear succession, Rome could descend into civil war as various generals and senators fought for the throne. So she took matters into her own hands. She either forged the adoption documents or simply announced that Trajan had made the adoption without any documents at all. She used her authority as empress to make the announcement credible, and she installed Hadrian, her chosen candidate, as emperor. Can I tell you what I think? I think theory 2 is more likely, not because I have definitive proof, but because the circumstances are so suspicious. And because Plotina had both the motive and the means to pull this off. She wanted Hadrian to be emperor. She had spent years grooming him for power, Trajan was not going to choose him. So when the opportunity presented itself, when Trajan died without naming a successor, Plotina seized control of the narrative. And here is the fascinating thing. Even if she did fabricate it, she did Rome a favor. Because Hadrian turned out to be an excellent emperor, he ruled for 21 years from 117 to 138. He consolidated the empire, stopped trying to expand further, built defensive fortifications like Hadrian's Wall in Britain. He traveled extensively, visiting all the provinces, addressing local problems, improving administration. He built the Pantheon in Rome, one of the most perfect buildings ever constructed. He patronized art, literature, philosophy. He was a Greek culture enthusiast in a way that Trajan never was. Hadrian was not perfect. He could be cruel. He executed several senators he saw as threats. His relationship with his young lover Antinous, who drowned mysteriously, was controversial, but by most measures he was a successful emperor who left Rome stronger than he found it. So if Plotina did install him through deception, she chose well. And that is what I find so interesting about this story. We often judge historical figures by their methods. Did they lie? Did they cheat? Did they manipulate? But maybe we should also judge them by their results. If Plotina really did forge Tron's succession, that was obviously wrong from a legal and moral standpoint. But it prevented a succession crisis. It gave Rome a capable emperor, and it maintained stability. So was it the right call? This gets at something deeper about power and gender in Rome. Plotina could not become emperor herself. Roman law and custom made that impossible. But she could choose who would be emperor. Or she could use her intelligence, her networks, her credibility as empress to shape the succession. And whether she did it legitimately or through deception, she exercised enormous power. Think about the level of audacity this required. If she really did forge the succession, she would have had to coordinate with other people. Someone had to write the documents if they were forged. Someone had to witness them. Multiple people would have had to agree to lie about what happened in that room. And they all had to keep the secret for the rest of their lives. That requires incredible force of personality, incredible political skill. Or maybe Plotina did not forge anything. Maybe Trajan really did come around in his final moments. Maybe he saw the wisdom in what Plotina had been telling him for years. Maybe he genuinely chose Hadrian. We will never know. And that is kind of the point. The historical ambiguity itself tells us something. It tells us that people at the time believed Plotina was capable of this. They believed she had that much influence, that much power, that much nerve. Whether she actually did it or not is almost beside the point. The fact that contemporaries thought she might have done it reveals how powerful she actually was. Compare this to the other women we have met. Sakani maneuvered her sons into power over decades. Theodora saved an empire in a moment of crisis. Julia Donner governed for years. Antonia exposed a conspiracy. Burra managed an empire's logistics. Turan ruled as regent. Tamar became a king. And Plotina, she potentially fabricated an imperial succession and got away with it. Each of these women found different ways to exercise power in systems that were not designed for them to have power. They worked within constraints, around constraints, sometimes breaking constraints entirely. And they did it because they were smart, capable, and refuse to accept the limitations placed on them. But here is what haunts me about Plotina's story. She spent years building Hadrian's career, advocating for him, preparing him for power, and when Trajan died, she made sure Hadrian became emperor, whether through legitimate succession or clever forgery. She basically created an emperor. And what does she get in the historical record? A few paragraphs, a footnote. Most people have never heard of her. Hadrian, once he became emperor, did honor Plotina. He deified her after her death. He built temples to her. He put her image on coins. He clearly felt gratitude, whether because she legitimately announced his succession or because she cleverly installed him. But the broader historical memory, it focuses on Hadrian, the emperor, not on Plotina, the kingmaker. And that is the pattern we keep seeing. The women who made empires work, who saved them from disaster, who chose who would rule, they fade from memory, while the men they empowered become the heroes of history. It is not fair, it is not accurate, but it is consistent. So, did Plotina forge Trajan's succession? I do not know. Nobody knows. The ancient sources are contradictory. The evidence is ambiguous. We are left with this fascinating historical mystery. But what I do know is that Plotina was formidable. She was brilliant, and she changed the course of Roman history. Whether she did it legitimately or illegitimately is less important than the fact that she did it at all. We have met 9 women now. 9 women who saved or shaped empires. 9 women who exercised real power. And we have 3 more to go. But the next story is going to be different from the others because we're about to meet a woman who did not work within any system. She was not part of the ruling family. She was not even free for most of her life. And yet, in one of history's darkest moments, she became the only thing standing between an entire population and annihilation. Stay with me. Her story will break your heart and fill you with hope. At the same time, sometimes the measure of true power is not what you can destroy, but what you can save. And in February of the year 1258 in the city of Baghdad, as one of the greatest cultural centers in human history was being systematically destroyed, as hundreds of thousands of people were being slaughtered, as the Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from thrown books and red with blood from murdered scholars, one woman stood between a conqueror and the complete annihilation of an entire religious community. Her name was Duz, Cartoon. And what she did in those terrible days echoes across centuries as one of history's most profound acts of mercy in the midst of unimaginable violence. Let me take you to a moment that changed the world. It is January 1258. A Mongol army, maybe 150,000 strong, surrounds Baghdad. This is not just any city. Baghdad is the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of Islamic learning and culture for 500 years. It is one of the largest cities in the world, home to perhaps 1 million people. Its libraries contain hundreds of thousands of books, preserving knowledge from across the Islamic world and beyond. Its scholars are the finest minds of the age. Baghdad is in many ways the intellectual heart of the medieval world, and Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, son of Tului, and Sorghakani Beki, has come to destroy it. The Mongols demand surrender. The Kaif refuses, apparently believing his city is impregnable. He is wrong. The Mongols breach the walls on February 5th, and what happens next is one of the greatest catastrophes in human history. The Mongols systematically massacre the population of Baghdad. The death toll is debated by historians. Some sources say 200,000. Some say as high as 1 million. The truth is probably somewhere in between. But even at the lower estimates, we're talking about one of the deadliest events of the medieval period. Soldiers, scholars, women, children, elderly. Nobody is spared. The streets run with blood. Bodies are stacked so high that they block roads and the books. The Mongols throw the books from the House of Wisdom, one of the greatest libraries in history, into the Tigris River. So many books that the river reportedly turns black with ink. Imagine that. Centuries of accumulated knowledge, irreplaceable manuscripts, works of science and mathematics and philosophy and poetry, all destroyed in days. The historian Rashid Arlen, writing decades later, calls it one of the cultural catastrophes of human history. And he is right. The Caliph himself, the religious and political leader of the Islamic world, is executed. According to legend, the Mongols wrap him in a carpet and have horses trample him to death because there is a superstition about not spilling royal blood. Whether that specific detail is true or not, the caliph is definitely killed, ending the Abbas Caliphate that had ruled for over 500 years. Now, in the middle of all this horror, there are Christians living in Baghdad. Not a lot, but they are there. Baghdad, for all its importance to Islam, has always had religious minorities. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, others. These communities have existed for centuries, sometimes thriving, sometimes persecuted, but surviving. And when the Mongols attack, these Christians are terrified, because the Mongols are not particularly discriminating in their massacres. They kill Muslims, Christians, everyone. But then something extraordinary happens. Someone intervenes. Someone with enough influence over Hula Khan to make him stop, at least partially, to make him spare some lives. That someone is his wife, Doll Khartoum. So who is Doll? Let me tell you her story, because it is fascinating. She was born sometime in the early 1200s into the Karate tribe, the same tribe that Sogtani Beki came from. In fact, Dox was Sorgan's niece. So she grew up watching her aunt exercise power, learning how to navigate Mongol politics. And like her aunt, Dos was a Nestoran Christian. Now when I say Nestoran Christian, I need to explain what that means. Nestoranism was a branch of Christianity that developed in the 5th century, named after a theologian named Nestorius. It spread east along the Silk Road, finding followers in Persia, Central Asia, even China. By the 13th century, there were Nestoran Christian communities all across the Mongol Empire, and many Mongol noble families, including the Keretes, had converted to Nestorian Christianity. Dox married Hula Khan, probably in the late 1230s or early 1240s. This was a strategic marriage cementing alliances between Mongol families. But it was also a meeting of two strong personalities. Hulagu was a military commander, ruthless and effective. Dulx was intelligent, devout, and had her own power base. She was not just a passive wife. She had her own retinue, her own resources, her own influence, and she was deeply committed to her Christian faith. The sources describe her as being very pious, as supporting Christian communities wherever she went, as building churches and supporting monasteries. This was not unusual for Mongol noble women. Remember, the Mongols were generally religiously tolerant. They did not care what religion you practiced as long as you paid taxes and obeyed the Khen. So Dox could practice her Christianity openly and even use her position to protect other Christians. When Hulagu was sent west to conquer Persia and Iraq, Doc went with him, just like Berta traveled with Genghis Khan, just like Julia Domna traveled with Septimius Sai's Mongol noble. Women often accompanied their husbands on campaign. They were not just there for comfort. They had administrative roles. They managed the logistics, the supplies, the camp followers. They were part of the command structure. So Dox is there as Hulagu's army moves through Persia. She is there as they besiege fortresses, conquer cities, destroy the assassin strongholds, and she is there when they reach Baghdad in January 1258. She sees the siege, she sees the walls breached, and she sees the beginning of the massacre. Now put yourself in Dox's position for a moment. You're a Christian woman in a Mongol army that is massacring a Muslim city. Your husband is the commander. The soldiers are following his orders. The violence is overwhelming, unstoppable. And somewhere in that city there are Christians, maybe a few thousand, maybe 10,000, who are going to die along with everyone else. What do? Do something that takes immense courage. She intercedes. She goes to Hulagu and she pleads for the Christians of Baghdad. And here is where the story becomes almost biblical, because Do's intervention is directly compared by medieval sources to Queen Esther in the Hebrew Bible. You know, the story of Esther. A Jewish woman becomes queen of Persia. Her people are threatened with genocide. She risks her life by approaching the king uninvited and pleading for her people, and the king listens to her and spares the Jews. Dol does the same thing. She approaches Hulagu and she says, "Spare the Christians, protect the churches, let my people live." And Hulagu, who is ordering the deaths of hundreds of thousands, who is destroying one of the greatest cities in the world, who is creating a monument of terror that will be remembered for centuries, says yes to his wife. The contemporary historian, Fuati, who lived through the siege of Baghdad, writes about this. He describes how the Christians of Baghdad were protected, how their churches were not burned, how they were allowed to survive when almost everyone else died. Another historian, Barraus, a Christian writing in Syriac, explicitly credits Do with saving the Christian community. And it is not just in Baghdad. As Hulagu's conquests continue across Persia and Mesopotamia, Dulks consistently protects Christian communities. She has churches built. She gives money to monasteries. She makes sure that Christian leaders have access to Hulagu. She creates a kind of shield around the Christian population of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol state that Hulagu is creating. The historian Rashid Alin writes that Doks strongly supported the Christians so that under her protection they had great influence. This is huge, in the middle of the Mongol conquest, which are brutal and terrifying for everyone. Christians find themselves in a paradoxically protected position because the wife of the Khan is one of them. And there is something even more remarkable. Doc's protection extends beyond just passive non-violence. She actively promotes Christianity. She has a portable church that travels with the army, a tent set up as a chapel where Christian services are held, ambassadors from Christian kingdoms, envoys from the Crusader states, even the King of Armenia. They all come to meet with dogs. They recognize her as a powerful ally, someone who can influence Mongol policy toward Christian territories. In fact, there is a fascinating moment where Dok and Hulagu briefly ally with the Crusaders against Muslim forces. This is an unlikely alliance, Mongols and European Christians fighting together. And Dok is part of what makes that alliance possible. She's a bridge between two very different Christian traditions, the Nestorian East and the Catholic West. But here is what I want you to really understand. Du's power was not Offici. She was not a regent. She did not have an official title like co-ruler. She was the Khan's wife, which gave her status, but it did not give her formal authority. Her power came from her relationship with Hulagu, from his respect for her judgment, from his willingness to listen to her. It was personal power, not institutional power, and that made it fragile. When Dawes died in 1265, just 7 years after the fall of Baghdad, Christian protection in the Ilkhanate weakened. Future Khan were not Christian, their wives were not Christian. The special status that Christians had enjoyed under Dok's influence gradually eroded, which tells you how much of that protection was directly because of her. Can we take a moment to appreciate the moral complexity of this situation? Dulks was married to a man who was responsible for one of the greatest mass killings in history. Hulagu's conquest of Baghdad killed somewhere between 200,000 and 1 million people. He destroyed countless cultural treasures. He ended the Abbasid Caliphate. He created a legacy of fear and hatred that persists to this day in parts of the Middle East. And yet Dos used her position to save lives, thousands of lives, maybe tens of thousands. She could not stop the massacre entirely, but she could carve out zones of protection, create exceptions, save communities, and she did. Does that absolve her of complicity in her husband's actions? No. Does it make her a hero? I do not know. But it makes her something more complicated than either a hero or a villain. It makes her a human being trying to do good in the middle of overwhelming evil. There is philosophical question here about moral responsibility. If you are close to power, if you have influence over someone who is doing terrible things, what is your obligation? Is it enough to mitigate the harm, to save some people even if you cannot stop the larger atrocity? Or are, You complicit simply by being there, by not leaving, by not publicly denouncing it. I do not have an answer to that question. I think different people will answer it differently based on their own moral frameworks, but I think Doss's story forces us to grapple with it because she was not powerless. She had influence. She used that influence to save Christians, but she could not or did not use it to stop the massacre entirely. Does that make her a savior or a bystander? What I do know is that for the Christians who survived Baghdad because of her intervention, Dox was their salvation. For the families who were spared, for the children who grew up because she spoke on their behalf, she was a hero, and the historical sources written by Christians reflect that. They praise her. They compare her to Esther, to the great women of the Bible. They remember her with gratitude. But Islamic sources have a different perspective. To them, Dogs represents the foreign influence that enabled the Mongol destruction of the Islamic world. Her Christianity, her protection of Christians, her influence over Huligu, all of that is seen more negatively. She is part of the catastrophe even if she tried to limit it. And that is the thing about history. Your role in it depends on whose story is being told. Dos is simultaneously a savior and a collaborator, a protector and an enabler, depending on who is telling the story and what their perspective is. What strikes me most about Dos is her agency in an impossible situation. She did not create the Mongol conquests. She did not order the massacres, but she was there and she made choices. She chose to use her influence to protect people. She chose to build churches and support Christian communities. She chose to intercede for mercy in the middle of merciless violence. Those were her choices and they mattered. And maybe that is the lesson here. We do know. We always control our circumstances. Do not choose to live in an era of conquest and destruction, but we do control how we act within our circumstances. And in her circumstances, Dox chose mercy. She chose to save who she could save. She chose to use her power, limited as it was, for protection rather than destruction. We have now met 10 women. 10 women who changed empires. 10 women who exercise power in different ways through different means with different results. And we have 2 more stories left. But these last 2 are going to be different again because we are going to meet women who not only saved empires but who fought physically, who led armies, who put their own bodies on the line, starting with a woman who at age 60 stood up to the British Empire and said, "Not without a fight. Stay with me. Her courage is going to inspire you." When does someone become too old to fight? At what age do we decide that a person should step back, accept defeat, let younger people take over? The British Empire had an answer to that question in the year 1900. They thought a 60-year-old woman would be easy to handle, that age and gender would make her weak, that she would submit without resistance. They were catastrophically wrong because that 60-year-old woman stood up in a council of male chiefs who were ready to surrender. And she delivered one of the most powerful speeches in African history, a speech that shamed men into action and launched a war that nearly defeated one of the most powerful empires on earth. Her name was Ya Asantewa. And if you've never heard of her, that tells you everything about who gets to write history. Let me transport you to West Africa, to what is now Ghana in the late 19th century. The Ashanti Empire is one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in Africa. It has existed for about 200 years, growing wealthy from gold mining and trade. It has a complex political system, a strong military, rich cultural traditions. The capital Kumasi is a thriving city, and at the heart of Ashanti identity is an object so sacred that it represents the soul of the nation itself, the golden stool. Now, the golden stool is not just some fancy throne. According to Ashanti tradition, it descended from heaven in the late 1600s and contains the spirit of the Ashanti people. It is never sat upon, not even by the king. It is kept on its own throne. It is the ultimate symbol of Ashanti sovereignty and independence. To possess the golden stool is to rule the Ashanti. To demand the golden stool is to demand the complete submission of the nation. And in 1896, the British demand the golden stool. Well, not directly at first. What happens is that the British have been expanding their control over West Africa for decades. They have been fighting wars with the Ashanti on and off since 1823. The Ashanti have been resisting British colonization fiercely. But by the 1890s, British military technology, especially machine guns, has become overwhelmingly superior. And in 1896, the British finally defeat the Ashanti in battle, capture the King Premp I and exile him to the Sales. With the king gone, the British think they have won. They install a governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, and assume the Ashanti will now accept colonial rule, and for a few years there is an uneasy peace. But in March of 1900, Governor Hodgson makes a catastrophic mistake. He travels to Kumasi and demands to sit on the golden stool. He does not just want to see it, he wants to physically sit on it to demonstrate British supremacy. Can you imagine the shock and outrage? This is like someone demanding to burn your country's flag while urinating on your constitution. The golden stool is not just a symbol, it is the spiritual essence of the Ashanti people, and this British governor, this representative of a foreign power that has invaded their land and exiled their king, wants to desecrate it. The Ashanti are horrified. They are furious, but they are also afraid because they have just lost a war. Their king is gone. The British have guns and artillery and an empire behind them. What can they possibly do? The chiefs and elders gather in secret to discuss the crisis, and the mood is dark. Many of them are ready to surrender. They say, "We cannot fight the British again. We will lose. We will all be killed or exiled. We should just give them what they want, try to preserve what we can." Man after man stands up and argues for submission, for realistic, pragmatic surrender. And then a woman stands up. Her name is Ya Asantewa. She's about 60 years old. She's the queen mother of Ajisu, which means she is the female ruler of one of the Ashanti territories. In Ashanti society, queen mothers are not just ceremonial, they have real political power. They advise the king. They participate in council decisions. They can even choose who becomes king. Ya Asante has been in politics for decades. She knows how power works, and she's had enough of this defice talk. According to the accounts that have been passed down, Yanti delivers a speech that changes everything. The exact words vary depending on the source, but the essence is consistent. She says something like this: "Now I see that some of you fear to go forward, to fight for our king. If it were in the brave days of old, chiefs would not sit down to see their king taken away without firing a shot. No European could have dared speak to chiefs of Ashanti in the way the governor spoke to you this morning. Is it true that the bravery of Ashanti is no more? I cannot believe it. It cannot be. I must say this. If you, the men of Ashanti, will not go forward, then we will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the British until the last of us falls in the battlefields." Let that sink in for a moment. A 60-year-old woman is standing in a room full of male chiefs and warriors, and she is shaming them. She is saying, "If you are too cowardly to defend our nation, then the women will do it. We will fight and die before we submit." And apparently she does not just make this speech. According to some accounts, she picks up a rifle and fires a shot to emphasize her point. Can you imagine being in that room? The shock, the shame, the sudden realization that this woman has more courage than all the men put together. The chiefs are stunned, and then they are mobilized because Yasanto has done something brilliant. She's made surrender impossible without losing all honor. She has forced them to choose between fighting and being seen as weaker than an old woman, and in a warrior culture that is no choice at all. Within days, the Ashanti begin organizing for war. Ya Asantewa is not just the inspiration. She becomes one of the military leaders. She helps coordinate the armies, plan strategy, maintain morale, and in April of 1900 the war begins. The Ashanti attack British positions and they lay siege to the British fort in Kumasi, trapping Governor Hodgson and about 3,000 people inside. Now the British are shocked. They thought the Ashanti were defeated, pacified, ready to accept colonial rule. Instead, they are facing a full-scale rebellion led by a woman. And the Ashanti are not just fighting, they are winning. The siege of Kumasi lasts for months. The British inside the fort are running out of food, water, ammunition. They are desperate. If reinforcements do not arrive soon, they will have to surrender or die. The British governor eventually escapes with some troops fighting their way out of the siege, but the Ashanti continue the war. They attack British supply lines, ambush patrols, control the countryside for months. Yahasantewa and the Ashanti armies keep the British on the defensive, and this is in 1900, at the absolute height of British imperial power. The British Empire controls a quarter of the world's land area. They have modern rifles, artillery, and military organization, and they are being fought to a standstill by an African kingdom led by a 60-year-old woman. But of course, the British cannot let this stand. The humiliation is too great. So they send massive reinforcements, thousands of additional troops, heavy artillery, modern weapons. By September of 1900, the British have assembled an overwhelming force and they launch a systematic campaign to crush the Ashanti resistance. Even then, Yahasantewa and her forces keep fighting. They retreat to the forests using guerrilla tactics, refusing to give up, but eventually the numbers and firepower are too much. In September of 1900, Yahasantewa is captured. She is taken prisoner along with other Ashanti leaders, and the British, having learned their lesson about underestimating her, do not take any chances. They exile her to the Seychelles, the same place they exiled King Prempeh. She will never see Ghana again. Yahasantewa lives in exile for 21 years. 21 years away from her homeland, her people, everything she fought for. She dies in 1921 at about age 80. She never got to go home. The British never allowed it. They kept her in exile until she died because they understood, even if they would never admit it publicly, that she was dangerous, that her mere presence in Ghana would inspire resistance. So what was the result of the war? The British officially annexed the Ashanti territories, making them part of the Gold Coast colony. The golden stool was never found, by the way. The Ashanti hid it successfully, and it remains a sacred object in Ghana to this day. The British never got to sit on it. So in that sense, Yahasantewa succeeded. She prevented the desecration of the most sacred symbol of her people. But the larger question is, was the war worth it? The Ashanti lost their independence. Many people died. The leaders were exiled. From a purely practical standpoint, maybe surrender would have been better. But here is the thing. Some things are worth fighting for even if you lose. Some lines cannot be crossed without resistance. And Yahasantewa understood that. She understood that if the Ashanti simply handed over the golden stool without a fight, they would lose something more important than political independence. They would lose their dignity, their identity, their soul as a people. Now, here is the question I want you to think about. Why have you probably never heard of Yahasantewa? She led a war against the British Empire in 1900 at the height of imperialism. She was a 60-year-old woman who shamed male chiefs into fighting. She commanded armies, directed sieges, resisted for months against overwhelming odds. Her story has everything: courage, drama, gender politics, anti-colonial, resistance. It is an incredible story. So why is she not famous? I will tell you why. Because African history, especially African resistance to colonialism, has been systematically erased from Western historical narratives. When I was in school, we learned about European explorers discovering Africa. We learned about European colonization. We learned about independence. movements in the 1950s and 60s, but we never learned about the centuries of African resistance before that. We never learned about the queens and warriors and strategists who fought against colonization every step of the way. And this is not an accident. This is a deliberate choice in how history is taught, because acknowledging people like Yasanta means acknowledging that colonization was not some benevolent civilizing mission. It was conquest, resisted fiercely by people who did not want to be conquered. It means acknowledging that Africans were not passive victims waiting to be saved. They were active agents of their own history fighting for their freedom. There is also a gender element here. Ya Asantewa does not fit comfortable narratives about African women. She was not a victim needing rescue. She was not primitive or backward. She was a sophisticated political leader who understood strategy and military tactics. She commanded respect from male warriors. She led armies into battle that threatens multiple stereotypes at once. Stereotypes about Africans, stereotypes about women, stereotypes about age. And here is the pattern I want you to see. Every single woman we have talked about in this series has been erased or minimized to some degree, but the women from non-European civilizations like Yasantewa have been erased even more completely. Sagani, Becky, Berthe, Tamar, Dox, Khatun, Yasantewa. These women are almost unknown in the West, while Theodora or Julia Donner at least get footnotes in Roman history. African and Asian queens barely get mentioned at all. This is colonialism working through historical memory. The colonizers did not just conquer territories, they conquered narratives. They decided what stories would be told and which would be forgotten, and they made sure that stories of resistance, especially successful resistance, especially resistance led by women, were buried. But in Ghana, Ya Santo is a national hero. There are schools named after her, statues of her image on currency. Ghanaian children learn her story. They learn about her courage, her leadership, her refusal to surrender. She is celebrated as one of the greatest figures in Ghanaian history. It is only outside of Ghana that she is unknown. And that tells you who controls the global narrative. I want to end with this thought. Ya Asantewa was 60 years old when she led that war. 60. In a time when life expectancy was much lower than today, she could have said, "I am too old for this. Let younger people fight. I have earned my rest." Instead, she picked up a rifle and led her people into battle. She spent the last 21 years of her life in exile, never seeing her home again, because she refused to submit. What would you do at 60? What cause would you be willing to fight and die for? What line would you refuse to let be crossed, regardless of the cost? Ya Asantewa had that clarity. She knew what mattered and she acted on it. Consequences be damned. We have met 11 women now. 11 women who saved or shaped empires through intelligence, courage, administration, mercy, and warfare. Each one found a different path to power. Each one changed history. Each one was forgotten or minimized by the historical record. And we have one more story to go, one more woman who exercised power in a way that should make her legendary. And this last one is going to tie everything together because she ruled not through her husband or son, not as a consort or regent, but in her own right for over 40 years, longer than most kings ever dreamed of, ruling. Her story is next, and it is the perfect ending to our journey. Stay with me. 42 years. That is longer than most emperors ruled, longer than Genghis Khan conquered, longer than Queen Victoria's early reign, 42 years of continuous influence over one of the most powerful empires in the world, and the woman who achieved this did so through a strait. That was absolutely brilliant in its simplicity and radicalism. She took a vow of virginity at age 15, and that vow gave her more power than marriage ever could have. Her name was Pulsaria, and she is the perfect ending to our journey, because she proves that power comes in forms we often fail to recognize. Let me take you to Constantinople in the year 414. The Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, is in a precarious position. The emperor is Theodosius II. He is only 13 years old. His father just died. And the empire is surrounded by threats. Persians to the east, barbarian tribes pushing from the north, theological disputes tearing apart the Christian church from within. The empire needs strong leadership, but the emperor is a child. Enter his older sister, Pulcheria. She's only 15 years old herself, but she's already more politically savvy than most adults, and she makes a decision that will define her entire life and reshape the Byzantine Empire. She takes a public vow of perpetual virginity. She dedicates herself to God, promising never to marry, never to have sexual relations, to live a life of religious devotion. Now, why would a 15-year-old princess do this? At first glance, it seems like she's giving up power, right? In most societies, women gain power through marriage, through becoming mothers, through their relationships to men. By vowing never to marry, Pulcheria seems to be closing off the traditional path to female power. But she's actually doing something much cleverer. See, if Pulcheria married, she would become someone's wife. Her husband would have authority over her. If he was ambitious, he might try to seize the throne from her brother. If he was controlling, he might limit her political involvement. Marriage would actually reduce her independence. But if she never marries, if she is permanently unavailable, then she can remain her BR, others' closest advisor, his most trusted confidant, without any competing male authority in her life. And there is a second brilliant aspect to this. By framing her unmarried state as religious devotion, rather than just remaining single, Pulcheria gains enormous moral authority. In the deeply Christian Byzantine Empire, virginity is seen as a holy state, especially for women. By taking this vow, Pulcheria is not just a princess. She is a holy woman, someone who has sacrificed worldly pleasures for spiritual purity. That gives her a kind of power that even emperors have to respect, and it works. In 414, when she is only 15 years old, Pulcheria is named Augusta. This is the highest title a woman can hold in the empire, equivalent to empress. No woman this young has ever held this title before. But the Senate and the Church approve it because Pulcheria has framed herself as a pious holy figure. She is not threatening. She is not seeking power for its own sake. She is dedicated to God and to serving the empire. At least that is the narrative, and it is a narrative that gives her enormous room to maneuver. Pulcheria also convinces her younger sisters Arcadia and Marina to take the same vow of virginity. So now you have 3 imperial princesses, all dedicated to religious life, all wielding moral authority. They turn the imperial palace into something like a monastery. They maintain strict religious observances, prayer schedules, charitable works. This is all very public, very visible, and it creates an image of the imperial family as pious and holy, which strengthens their legitimacy. But behind this religious facade, Pulcheria is doing hardcore politics. She is effectively running the empire while her brother Theodosius sits on the throne. And Theodosius is not a strong emperor. The historical sources describe him as weak-willed, more interested in calligraphy and theology than in governance. He is content to let his sister handle the actual work of ruling, which is exactly what Pulcheria wants. So what does Pulcheria do with this power? A lot. First, she manages the imperial bureaucracy. She appoints competent administrators. She oversees tax collection, military logistics, diplomatic relations with other states. She is essentially the prime minister, except without the title. Second, she dominates religious policy. And in the Byzantine Empire, religion is politics. Theological disputes are not just abstract debates. They determine who has power in the church, which bishops support which political factions, how the empire relates to different Christian communities. And in 431, Pulcheria makes her biggest move. There is a massive theological controversy going on about the nature of Christ and Mary. A bishop named Nestorius, the Patriarch of Constantinople, is teaching that Mary should not be called Mother of God, but only Mother of Christ. This might seem like a minor distinction, but it has huge implications for how Christians understand the divinity of Jesus. And Pulcheria strongly disagrees with Nestorius, so Pulcheria uses her influence to convene a church council, the Council of Ephesus, to settle the dispute. This is a gathering of hundreds of bishops from across the Christian world, and Pulcheria makes sure that the council condemns Nestorius and affirms that Mary is indeed Mother of God. Nestorius is deposed and exiled. Pulcheria's theological position becomes official church doctrine. And this matters because it shapes Christian theology for the next 1600 years. Every time a Christian calls Mary the Mother of God, they're affirming a theological position that Pulcheria fought for and won. Think about the level of power that represents. A woman in her 30s who holds no official government position, who is not empress in her own right, is determining Christian doctrine for the entire Roman Empire and beyond. That is extraordinary. And she does it all while maintaining the fiction that she is just a pious virgin dedicated to God's service. For decades, this is the pattern. Theodosius is the emperor in name. Pulcheria is the power behind the throne. She does not command armies, but she determines military policy. She does not sit on the throne, but she chooses who gets appointed to key positions. She does not preach sermons, but she shapes religious orthodoxy. She's the most powerful person in the Eastern Roman Empire for nearly 30 years. And most people are not even consciously aware of it, because she operates so skillfully in the shadows. Then in 450, Theodosius dies. He falls off his horse and dies from his injuries. He is only 49 years old, and suddenly there is a succession crisis. Theodosius had no sons. Who will be the next emperor? This is the moment where Pulcheria's lifetime of careful positioning pays off. She is now 51 years old. She has been wielding power for 36 years. She has more experience governing than anyone else in the empire, and she essentially chooses who becomes emperor. She selects a man named Marion. He is a respected general about 60 years old, widowed, politically moderate, and Pulcheria offers him a deal. I will marry you, making you legitimate as emperor, but we will maintain my vow of virginity. This will be a political marriage, not a real one. You will rule jointly with me, but I retain my holy status and my authority. And Marcian agrees. So Pulcheria, at age 51, marries for the first time, but it is a marriage in name only. They never consummate it. She remains a virgin, maintaining her religious credentials, but now she has an additional title, Empress, wife of the reigning emperor. She has combined religious authority with political legitimacy in a way that is unprecedented. Pulcheria and Marcian ruled together for 3 years until Pulcheria's death in 453, and those 3 years are successful. They convene another church council, the Council of Chalcedon, in 451, which further defines Christian doctrine. They maintain stability in the empire. They keep the economy functioning. And when Pulcheria dies at age 54, she is mourned as a saint. The church later officially recognizes her as Saint Pulcheria. So let us do the math here. Pulcheria takes her vow of virginity in 414. She's named Augusta that same year. She effectively rules through her brother from 414 to 450, 36 years. Then she rules jointly with Marcian from 4550 to 453 more years. That is 39 years of active rule. But her influence actually spans 42 years if you count from when she first gained prominence in 414 to her death in 453. 42 years. Compare that to most of the emperors we have talked about in this series. Trajan ruled 19 years. Hadrian ruled 21 years. Most Byzantine emperors were lucky to get 10 years. But Pulcheria, who was never officially emperor, who always operated through others, influenced the empire for over 4 decades. That is longer than most dynasties. And she did it all while maintaining this image of holy virginity. She was never accused of being power-hungry or ambitious in the negative sense because she framed everything she did as service to God and to the empire. She could not be attacked as a scheming woman trying to use her male authority because she presented herself as a humble servant of Christ. It was perfect defensive positioning, but make no mistake, Pulseria was ambitious. She wanted power. She enjoyed power. She used power to shape the world according to her vision. She just was smart enough to frame her ambition in terms that her society could accept, and that is genius-level political strategy. Now, as we come to the end of this journey through history, I want you to think about what we have discovered. We started with a question: why do history books focus on kings and generals and battles and ignore the women who actually made empires function? And over the past few hours, we have met 12 women who provide the answer. These women were not just influential, they were essential. They saved empires from collapse. They prevented civil wars. They shaped succession. They made administrative systems work. They protected populations. They led armies. They determined religious doctrine. Without them, the empires they served would have been very different, possibly would not have survived at all. Sorgagani Beki raised 4 sons who became emperors and modernized Mongol administration. Theodora saved Constantinople from the Nika riots through sheer courage. Julia Domna ran Rome for decades while emperors went to war. Kenneth, though, saved Tiberius from assassination with her perfect memory. Antonia Minor exposed Sajis and prevented a coup. Berta kept the Mongol Empire functioning while Genghis Khan conquered. Turigin ruled as regent and secured her son's succession despite later historians trashing her reputation. Tamar became a king and presided over George's Golden Age. Platina may have chosen a Roman emperor through clever manipulation. Doc's cartoon saved thousands during the destruction of Baghdad. Ya Asantewa led a war against the British Empire at age 60, and Pulseria shaped the Byzantine Empire and Christian theology for 42 years. 12 women, 12 different paths to power, 12 different strategies for survival and success in patriarchal systems. And here is the pattern. Every single one of them was erased, minimized, or demonized by history. Even the ones who are praised in their own time, like Sorgakani, became footnotes in later histories that focused on men. The ones who were more openly ambitious, like Turagan, were condemned as core. The ones from non-European cultures, like Ya Santuar, were simply ignored by Western historical narratives. Why? Why does this keep happening? I think there are several reasons. First, history has traditionally been written by men, and men often do not notice or care about forms of power that do not look like male power. They notice armies and battles and formal titles. They miss administrative work, diplomatic, maneuvering, information networks, soft power. Second, acknowledging female power threatens the narrative that men are natural leaders and women are natural followers. If we admit that women like Pulkia or Julia Donner were effectively ruling empires, we have to rethink our assumptions about gender and leadership. Third, many of these women operated in ways that were deliberately subtle. They had to because open female ambition was dangerous. So they worked through others, claimed to be acting for sons or husbands or God, and historians took those claims at face value rather than seeing the strategy behind them. But the truth is, empires do not run on conquest alone. They run on administration, on diplomacy, on information gathering, on succession planning, on economic management, on cultural cohesion. And women were doing much of that work, not because they were relegated to domestic spheres, but because they were smart enough to recognize where real power lay and skilled enough to seize it. And here is what I want you to take away from this. Power is not always visible. The person on the throne is not always the person making the decisions. The general leading the army might not be as important as the administrator keeping the supply lines open. The emperor might matter less than his wife, his sister, his mother. History is full of women who changed the world by working in the shadows, by being indispensable rather than conspicuous, by making themselves essence. EL to those who held formal power. Does that mean we should celebrate this shadow power? Should we be happy that women had to work through men, hide their ambition, pretend to be acting for others? No, these women deserve to rule openly, to receive credit for their work, to be recognized by history. The fact that they had to be so strategic, so careful, so indirect is a tragedy. But within those constraints, they were remarkable. They found ways to exercise real power, to shape empires, to change history, and that deserves recognition. So, what do we do with this knowledge? First, we question the history we have been taught. When we read about great kings and emperors, we ask who was actually doing the work, who was advising them, who managed the empire while they were away, who cleaned up their mistakes. Second, we look for the women who have been erased. We seek out their stories. We amplify their voices. We refuse to accept historical narratives that pretend women were absent or irrelevant. Third, we recognize that power comes in many forms. We stop valorizing only the most visible, violent forms of power and start acknowledging the power of intelligence, administration, networking, and strategy. And maybe, just maybe, we start telling these stories to young people. Imagine if children learned about Sorgatani Beki alongside Genghis Khan, if they learned about Theodora's speech alongside the battles of Belisarius, if they learned about Yanto alongside other anti-colonial leaders. How would that change their understanding of what women can do? How would that change their assumptions about power and gender and leadership? These 12 women saved empires, they changed history, and for too long they have been forgotten. But not anymore, not by us. We know their names now, we know their stories, and we have a responsibility to remember them, to share them, to make sure that the next generation knows that women have always been essential to how the world works, even when the history books pretended otherwise. Thank you for staying with me through this long journey. Thank you for listening to these stories, for caring about these forgotten women, for being willing to question the narratives we have been taught. If these stories moved you, if they made you think differently about history, please share this video, talk about these women, say their names, because every time we tell these stories, we push back against centuries of erasure. Every time we acknowledge these women, we make it a little bit easier for the next generation of women to claim their place in history openly without having to hide in the shadows. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge what we think we know about history, that reveal the hidden figures who shaped our world, then stay tuned, because history is full of forgotten people whose stories deserve to be told. We have only just begun. Until next time, remember, the most powerful people in history are often the ones you've never heard of, and maybe it is time we change that.